Baghdad. Meanwhile, coalition forces have seized the strategic Fa Peninsula, which is home to key oil installations. The port city of Qasr was also secured. As many as 10,000 Iraqi troops may have been a part of what Pentagon officials say is the most significant surrender to date. They say the Iraqi Army's 51st Division has given up to U.S. troops. That division had been defending Iraq's southern border. Our sister network, CNN Turk, is reporting Turkish troops have begun crossing into northern Iraq. Turkey says it needs troops to, quote, manage the humanitarian situation. But the U.S. has said it does not want Turkish troops moving into Kurdish-controlled areas for fear of deadly clashes. Iraq's ambassador to the UN slammed UN Secretary General Kofi Annan today for pulling weapons inspectors and humanitarian workers out of Iraq. Mohammed al-Duri also denounced Annan's proposal for humanitarian aid in a post-war Iraq. Annan's proposal would likely put the U.S. in charge of providing such aid. Coalition forces have seized control of Iraq's southern oil fields. In all, Pentagon officials say Iraq has set fire to about a dozen oil wells. Britain's defense secretary says the infrastructure of the oil fields remains intact. Government sources tell CNN federal authorities are looking at a possible link between Adnan al-Shukrajuma and dirty bomb suspect Jose Padilla. The FBI issued a worldwide alert for the Saudi-born al-Shukrajuma yesterday. Authorities think he may be involved with the al-Qaeda terror network. Those are the headlines at this hour. Now back to Larry King Live.
Thank you, Heidi. There are sirens in Baghdad right now. We don't know what they pertain to, but I think you can hear them. Sirens going off in Baghdad right now. What might that be, Colonel Hackworth?
That could be an all clear. I suspect that it's daylight there, and maybe they're just saying that you can come out of your holes. But those sirens are going to ring again, and it's not going to be long because the game plan here is going to be slam, bam, goodbye, Saddam. And this is a game of almost the Dallas Cowboys playing a junior high school team when you look at the superiority of our armed forces versus the opposition.
Would you agree, General Johnson, that this is that much disparity between the two?
It's quite a dramatic difference. We are so overwhelmingly superior, not just in terms of technology, but, you know, we could give them our weapon system, we'd probably still beat them. And we were just that much better trained and much better led.
Senator Hutchison, we'd like you to answer what Senator Durbin was answering with regard to protesters. How do you feel? Do you think it's bad form, or do you think the right continues throughout the battle?
Oh, of course, that is what makes America different from every other country in the world. People have a right to protest, and a peaceful protest is certainly in line with freedom of speech. I do think that I agree with Senator Durbin that we must make sure that our first responders have the money they need to do the job we're asking them to do. And we have not stepped up to the plate. I think there will be money in a supplemental appropriation as early as next week, and we must help these people train their policemen, train their firefighters, train their early responders to try to save lives in the event of a chemical or biological attack. I mean, these are the things that we haven't thought of in America ever before, but now we must, and we must fund them.
Al Jazeera, by the way, thank you both. Senators Kay Bailey Hutchison, Republican of Texas, Senator Dick Durbin, Democrat of Illinois. We thank you. We'll be calling upon you again. We'll be joined momentarily in Cody, Wyoming with Alan Simpson, the former United States Senator who served in the Senate from 1978 to 97, 10 of those years as his party's whip, and Senator George McGovern, the highly decorated World War II hero, 1972 Democratic presidential nominee, and former United States Senator from South Dakota. I am being told that we have checked in with Al Jazeera, the network in the Middle East, and they are reporting 2 missiles have landed three missiles now have landed in Iraq. 3 missiles have landed in Iraq, in Baghdad, Iraq, directly in Baghdad. Any comment, General Johnson?
It's not clear. You're talking about missiles landing in Baghdad. I mean, they're landing all the time. Cruise missiles and...
we're being told Al Jazeera is reporting this. Why is this... they're telling me it's new. I guess it's fresh start to the day.
Well, they're catching up with what's happening, I guess. There's certainly more than 3 missiles landing in Baghdad. It's a curious comment by Al Jazeera.
Yeah, anyway, why suddenly they're discovering it?
Now, if there were 3 missiles landing in Israel, that would be of some consequence, but if it's Baghdad...
That would be a story.
Yes.
Let's go to Dahouk, northern Iraq, and return with Jane Araf. What have you got to tell us, Jane?
Well, Larry, we're waiting to see exactly how many Turkish troops are going to cross that border. Now, as we were talking about, it's a volatile mix here, and this is something that's sure to make it more complicated and much more difficult. At the same time, we've got Mosul, the second biggest city in Iraq, just a few kilometers, about 40 kilometers, 25 miles behind us. Explosions there last night, of course, and more expected now that the U.S. can use Turkish airspace to go through and launch some attacks on Iraq. Larry?
Colonel Hackworth, do you make anything of daylight bombing?
No, especially with a cruise missile that can move in fast. It's not like an airplane where it could get knocked down and you lose the crew. So it's a pretty safe delivery system and damned accurate. It can put it right in your back pocket, Larry.
All right, let's be joined now by two former distinguished United States senators, distinguished Americans. Alan Simpson.
Specificity of this area, Iraq's front lines leading up to the Kurds around Kirkuk, Mosul apparently holding. But I was hearing Jane Araf talking to you a few moments ago about the probable entry of the Turkish army. You know, Larry, it'll be very interesting to see what effect that will have on the Kurds. The Kurds do field about 70,000 fighters in this area, and the Kurds have been very careful not to upset Ankara in the issue of independence. They've been not using that word now for months, no independence. They're talking about a federal, pluralistic Iraq. But if the Turks come in here and that stirs up trouble with the Kurds and they try and fight them, which is possible, they won't overcome them, they won't stop the entrance of the Turkish army, but they could certainly cause trouble, possibly with force of arms. But if the Turks come in here, maybe the Kurds might be tempted to do something against the Iraqis. Who knows? But it is a very complicating and potentially dangerous situation. In the meantime, there isn't the kind of bombardment, the kind of military pressure being exercised against Kirkuk and Mosul as we're seeing, obviously, in the Iraqi capital, Baghdad, only about 3 hours drive from here, if I could jump in the cars and go down there, which, of course, I can't. But the pressure that we're seeing there is not being applied here. So at the moment, I don't expect in the next hours any collapse, any surrenders on any mass scale in this area. But if that campaign turns to this area, then that could very well happen, as we're seeing now unfold in the south, Larry.
And would that, Brent, be another, like, mini-war?
It has the potential of a conflict, absolutely. Turks and Kurds fighting each other as the Turks come in. Maybe there's a deal that we don't know about the details of. We know that the Kurds were in Ankara trying to thrash out a deal with the U.S., with Zalmay Khalilzad, who's the special envoy of the president, with the authority to handle this. If there's a deal, maybe it'll work out okay. But the Kurds have been saying for months that there could be civil unrest, there could be resistance with force of arms. When the Turks come across that bridge, across those bridges into northern Iraq, we'll have to see. But certainly, it will certainly stir up a hornet's nest, Larry.
Colonel Hackworth, you think that this area might implode into spreading out?
Well, it certainly could. If you look at the century-old history between the Turks and the Kurds, they've got a lot of blood debts to settle, and I suspect that that thing is a big gasoline dump waiting for a match to be tossed in it, and the Turks coming down there is exactly that match.
George McGovern, do you expect expansion here?
Well, that's one of the problems with any war, Larry. You really don't know what the repercussions are going to be. I know that tonight we're kind of exhilarated about the effectiveness of our troops, and they are the best troops we've ever had. But I'm wondering what's going on in the minds of hundreds of thousands of young Arabs across the Arab world, across the Muslim world. I doubt if they share in the joy that has been expressed here tonight over the ability of America's military power to crush the state of Iraq. We don't know what this holds for us. I think there are a couple of other problems. One is that this is diverting our attention from the real problem of terrorism. We wouldn't be here tonight. We wouldn't be involved in the war in Iraq had it not been for the trauma of the 9/11 tragedy. The irony of that is that Iraq and Saddam Hussein had nothing whatsoever to do with that attack, and it was only after we were unable to find Osama bin Laden, who was the real culprit, that suddenly the administration came up with Saddam Hussein.
Do doubts ever enter your mind, General Johnson, in that regard, as Senator McGovern points out?
Long occupation, and let's do minimum destruction to the infrastructure so we can get this country up on its feet and running. But that is going to be about 100 miles of rocky road, because you look at that situation between the Kurds and the Turks and say how the Shiites and the Sunnis and all the rest of them, we're in the middle of the Hatfields and the McCoys big time here.
Politics aside, Senator McGovern, would you agree that at least the targets are such that there is less damage to the civilian?
Yes, and I'm very grateful to the American military for the care that they have exercised. Larry, I think one problem that's always raised with any kind of war we get into is that it diverts attention from other very serious problems. I believe that for years the #1 problem in the Middle East that we ought to be concerned with is the Arab-Israeli conflict. That's been the problem that has preempted the attention of one president after another, but in this case we're so involved with Saddam Hussein that we've forgotten that there's nothing going on in Iraq that is as serious as this long, smoldering Arab-Israeli dispute.
Alan Simpson, would you agree with that?
Well, sure, but it's been smoldering and smoldering, and presidents have been in it, and they're doing it, and we talk about a Palestinian state. That's a pretty good advance. Other things, other presidents haven't talked about that. There's continual talk, but as long as you have two people who hate each other's guts, like Sharon and Arafat, you're not going to get anywhere.
Ionia, Michigan, hello.
Hi. I would like to know, how are the Iraqis that are surrendering being treated? Are they being treated as prisoners of war?
General Johnson, what happens when an Iraqi surrenders?
Well, absolutely. Initially, obviously disarm them. They are prisoners of war under the Red Cross, the Geneva Convention, and I can guarantee you, as they were last time, they'll be scrupulously taken care of. Let me give you just one anecdotal example. Last war, the first POWs were clearly underfed. Some of them didn't even know whether they were fighting in Kuwait or Iraq. And our soldiers even gave them their own blankets. They were in such miserable shape. So I can guarantee you they'll be taken care of with great care by our U.S. troops.
Have we always been that way, Colonel Hackworth?
Just about. I think the American soldier has a great heart, and generally the soldier around the world has always loved, and then they go way out of their way to take care of a prisoner, and it's only in the heat of battle when infantryman meets infantryman up on that hill when it's dicey on how it's going to go. But once he gets back beyond the infantryman who just saw his best friend get killed, his situation gets better and better. We look after prisoners.
Well, we have a few moments remaining. I want to get the thoughts on what I think is going to happen. Alan Simpson, what do you think is going to happen? How quick? How soon? How's it going to end?
I can't hear. There's a great garbled communication, and I'm sorry I couldn't hear the Colonel.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
Ahead.
Okay.
Yes,
how do you think? What's the time frame? How do you think this is going to end?
Well, I only served 2 years in the infantry. I wasn't like George McGovern, who served with absolute honor and valor. But I can tell you, it's going to be fast until they get into where the infantry has to get involved. And boy, that could be really, really tough and horrendous, and could take time, real time, and
Senator
lives.
McGovern, how do you think it's going to end?
I think I would bow to the judgment of General Johnson and Colonel Hackworth. They're the military men, two of our best, that it probably will be a short war. But once the military phase is over, then the real problems begin. And that's trying to put Iraq back together, to monitor and police these internal disputes that have torn the country apart. And I think to rebuild our standing with our allies and with countries all around the world who, so far as I know, have never been in favor of this war.
How, Colonel Hackworth, do you see it ending? You said 30 days, didn't you?
Yeah, short war, a hard occupation. It is not going to be the occupation that we kind of enjoyed in Germany after World War II, Japan, or in Italy. It's going to be 100 miles of gravel road.
Hard in what respect? Because it's gravel road?
Yeah, just in terms of the different groups there that all hate each other's guts, and it's not going to be a country that's homogeneous like Japan, that the emperor said go along with MacArthur, and everybody did, and everyone was concerned after World War II picking up the bricks and rebuilding their houses and rebuilding their jobs and getting on with their life. It's going to be a settlement of some long-term feuds.
And General Johnson, how do you see it all wrapping up?
Well, I think it is going to be fast, Larry, but until we know if the Republican Guard is going to stay and fight, and certainly the Guard inside Baghdad, it could make it a much more difficult proposition. I think it'll be fast. Who would like to establish timelines? Certainly in the next week to 2 weeks, I should think, we will see probably the end of this military operation. And the beginning of the toughest part, of course, is reconstruction and setting up a government to run Iraq in the years ahead.
In other words, this will not be an easy aftermath.
It will be, by far, I think, the greatest challenge.
Thank you all very much. Thanks, Colonel Hackworth and Lieutenant General Johnson, for staying with us throughout the entire program. We'll be calling on you again, as we will former Senator Alan Simpson and former Senator George McGovern. We'll be with you right through the weekend. In fact, we'll be with you every night and all the days ahead for as long as this takes. And tomorrow night, among the guests will be former Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger and former Senator George Mitchell. Aaron Brown is right around the corner, and in that corner, with headlines, is Heidi Collins. I'm Larry King. Stay with us.
Thanks, Larry. I am Heidi Collins. Aaron Brown is next with ongoing coverage of the strike on Iraq. But first, here's what we know at this hour. The U.S. military continues to report new Iraqi surrenders. These Iraqis gave up earlier. And tonight, the Pentagon says for the first time, an entire Iraqi division, the 51st, has thrown down their arms and put up their hands. It is estimated to be as many as 8,000 or 10,000 Iraqi soldiers. The U.S. 3rd Infantry rolled through the southern town of Safwan today as residents greeted them and sang, "Saddam, your days are numbered." The so-called Wave of Steel, a convoy miles wide and miles long, continues barreling north toward Baghdad. It is now almost exactly the moment of sunrise in Baghdad. Within the hour, sirens rang out across the city and more explosions were heard. The air campaign that began last night, Iraqi time, is now expected to continue until tonight. That's what senior Defense Department sources tell CNN. You're looking at some of the worst of it now, which hit after nightfall in Baghdad. The so-called shock and awe campaign is expected to involve a total of 2,000 sorties and pound Baghdad with some 1,500 satellite-guided missiles, rockets, and other munitions. U.S. bombs have taken out some government targets in Baghdad. The entire Iraqi government, including its military command structure, is said to be in disarray tonight. Earlier today, Iraqi TV showed President Saddam Hussein meeting with top advisors. But the Pentagon claims Iraqi leaders have been cut off from troops in the field and reports decreased radio communications. Iraqi officials say the oil fires that U.S. troops are encountering as they march north are not sabotaged oil wells. The Iraqis say they have filled trenches with oil to ignite as a defensive measure. Here in the States, there is news about severe acute respiratory syndrome. The Centers for Disease Control reports 9 more people are suspected of having contracted the illness. That brings the total to 22 in this country. The World Health Organization announced there may be a breakthrough in attempts to develop a diagnostic test for the sometimes fatal illness. Continuing coverage of Strike on Iraq with Aaron Brown right now.
Good evening again, everyone. It is the dawn of a new day, Saturday morning in the Persian Gulf, Saturday morning in the Iraqi capital of Baghdad, a capital that was battered yesterday, their time, by American forces, the beginning of the shock and awe campaign. It is just now coming up on dawn there, 6 in the morning. These are the pictures from Baghdad. As many of you know, some of you may not, however, our correspondent, Nick Robertson, our correspondents actually, led by Nick Robertson, have been expelled and they are making their way out. We still have access to a number of locations and a number of correspondents, mostly from Arab language television networks that have been allowed to stay. There is some evidence tonight that the Iraqis, in terms of how information is going to come out of Iraq, are getting more than a little testy. How that might impact what we see as daylight comes, we don't know yet, but it's important to know, certainly for us, we want to know, American military planners want to know, what sort of damage was done beginning at about 9 o'clock last night Iraq time, middle of the day here in the United States on the East Coast, when this long-awaited shock and awe campaign began.
كبيرة وهائلة ربما هذا ما أشار له المسؤولون العسكريون.
This was a 7-minute attack, but imagine how long those 7 minutes must have felt. These bombs and missiles falling on the outskirts of Baghdad at selected military command and control targets. One of the things we would anticipate happening in the next 4 hours or so, if the Iraqis prove true to form, is we may well see some sort of tour of the damage. We get some sense what, if any, collateral damage, what, if any, civilian targets were erroneously hit. These are very precise, in most cases, very precise weapons, but they are still subject to error like any other thing that's mechanical. They don't always hit what they are intended to hit, and no one expects that there will be no civilian casualties in this. This went on for 7 minutes. There was a second strike that began 90 minutes or so later. And as the people of Baghdad wake up now on this Saturday morning and come out into the streets, these pictures now live in Baghdad, as you can see, very little activity on the streets there, but it's still very early in the morning, just a bit after 3 in the morning. Surely they must wonder what this day is going to bring, what it will bring in terms of the American military response, but they must also wonder who's running the country, how much control the government of Saddam Hussein has over the country. The message from the American side is that the government of Iraq is in disarray. Surely the Iraqis must wonder that as well. Is there a government of Iraq, and to what degree is it in control of any of the institutions of government? It's Saturday morning there. There has been a tremendous amount, there have been a tremendous number of developments over the last 24 hours or so, and we'll spend a lot of our time tonight taking a look at those and trying to figure out where next this goes. When we left you the other morning, yesterday morning, we anticipated today might be the day the attacks took place. The pictures on the big screen to the right of a major Air Force base in Great Britain, B-52s, over the last hour or so have been landing. They've been making runs across Iraq. One of the things to keep in mind while we're able to show you the pictures of these terrible attacks, terrible if you're on the other end of them, attacks at Baghdad, there have been missions flown throughout the country, certainly in the north of the country. We know These are pictures that we haven't been able to show you. We don't have cameras in those locations yet. We haven't seen what they have done, but these B-52s, these old workhorses of the Air Force, have been doing their duty, and they've been coming back now to this air base in Great Britain. There have already been some defections and surrenders by Iraqi forces, not especially surprising given what planners believed would happen, but they have started at the kind of units we were told to anticipate were not highly motivated to fight the fight. As you see, yet another one of those giant B-52s, and they go, General Wes Clark is with me, they go way back to, I think, before Vietnam, don't they? They have been a part of the American military arsenal for most of our lifetime, literally. As we sit here, they're obviously updated, as is the weaponry they carry, but that basic plane, that B-52, has been the heavy bomber for a long, long time. These planes coming back to England. Over at the Pentagon, Jamie McIntyre, our senior Pentagon correspondent. Jamie, there are a number of things I think that you can get us started on. There have been first of all, what is your sense of where the military campaign goes, and then go ahead and kind of transition into what we know about surrenders.
Well, Aaron, this was the day that the Pentagon delivered on its promise to dish out a punishing aerial assault on Baghdad, which they said was unprecedented in modern warfare. Now, the results aren't in yet. We know that there are a lot of government buildings in Baghdad in ruins, and as you mentioned, there have been some significant surrenders of Iraqi forces, in particular the 51st Division down in the south, an entire division apparently surrendering en masse, according to the Pentagon's report. But Pentagon officials here caution that despite the favorable battlefield reports, it's way too early to declare victory. The Pentagon calls it A-Day. A for the massive air assault that would drop more than 1,500 precision-guided bombs and missiles on hundreds of separate targets across Iraq. The Pentagon says it's a bombardment of historic proportions.
The weapons that are being used today have a degree of precision that no one ever dreamt of in a prior conflict.
The bombing, designed to shock and awe Iraq's military, centered on Baghdad, but also struck key targets in Mosul and Kirkuk in the north and Basra in the south.
We successfully accomplished our mission. We did everything that we set out to do. Everybody's back safe and sound.
All targets are designed to undermine the regime of Iraqi President Saddam Hussein and to convince his generals to turn on him or at least surrender. Such as, for instance, this presidential palace compound, which is located in downtown Baghdad. The concussions jolted Iraqi officials giving a military briefing. While some Iraqi regular troops are giving up, others are fighting. 2 U.S. Marines have been killed in action, and there are no signs yet Saddam Hussein's generals are defecting.
Apparently, what we have done thus far has not been sufficiently persuasive that they would have done that.
The U.S. has taken some ground in the south, including Qasr, a key southern port, along with 2 airfields in western Iraq. The southern oil fields have just about been secured, and the U.S. ground forces have moved more than 100 miles into Iraq from Kuwait. But the war is far from won.
Clearly, we're moving towards our objectives, but we must not get too comfortable. We're basically on our plan and moving towards Baghdad, but there are still many unknowns out there.
Two of those unknowns: what happens when the U.S. military comes face to face with the Republican Guard around Baghdad? Will they fold or fight? And are they armed with chemical weapons? And will they use them? Pentagon officials say that's their biggest concern at this time. And Aaron, so far in this aerial campaign, the so-called shock and awe campaign, no U.S. aircraft were lost.
May it stay that way, Jamie. Thank you very much. Michael Gordon writes about military matters, the chief military writer, I believe that's true, Michael, for the New York Times. He's at Camp Doha, which is in Kuwait, the central command post within Kuwait, and he's been working on the story of the surrender. Michael, how did it come about? Do you know?
Well, I think the surrender is noteworthy but not decisive, so I wouldn't invest too much importance in it. I mean, the 51st Division is a unit that was directly in the path of the invasion, and essentially the Americans have been seeking, along with the British, to facilitate this unit's surrender for some time. They've been bombarding them with leaflets, propaganda, broadcasts. I think they probably had some private negotiations with them. And the basic philosophy behind this is the United States wants to defeat the Iraqi military without destroying it. They don't want to stir up any more enmity than is necessary because they're going to become the governing authority in Iraq. So this unit eventually complied, and the commander and his deputy delivered his official surrender, and many of the troops themselves just sort of faded away into the night.
And so they have not been taken prisoner of war, as it were?
I don't know. I mean, honestly, Aaron, I think that this is a unit. I mean, the fight, as Jimmy McIntyre said, is with the Republican Guard.
Yeah.
And they haven't engaged them yet. And these units are just a bunch of speed bumps on the way to Baghdad.
I'm sorry, Michael, go ahead.
And so, well, they're just, they're units that the military confronts and has to deal with, the American forces, but is hoping, to fight as rarely as possible. So, this is, a unit like the 51st. There was another unit they were also trying to encourage to surrender, the 11th Division in al-Nasiriyah. And that was only partially successful because there was, from what I can tell, kind of a firefight at Talil Airport this past evening. So what you really have at this point in time, I think that the way to look at this is what you have at this point in time is some pockets of resistance. There was fighting in Qasar, there was some fighting in the Ramallah oil field, there was fighting at the Talil airfield, which they were moving to take. I mean, 2 Marines were killed in this fighting yesterday. And on the other hand, there seem to be some units that don't want to have anything to do with this, like the 51st Division and some portions of the 11th that the American military is dealing with. But all of this is just a prelude for the real battle. The real battle is in Baghdad. The real battle hasn't begun yet. And I think that it begins in the outskirts of Baghdad, actually, as they begin to confront the Medina, the Hammurabi, and Al-Nidal divisions. And I think there just is enormous uncertainty as to whether these units are attacked, to what extent they're cohesive, how determined they are to fight, and whether they're going to try to go back into the city and turn this into urban warfare. And I think that's what's all to be decided in the next few days.
Just, Michael, two questions, if we can hold you for a minute. Essentially, the way the Iraqi military is set up, the least well-trained, the least motivated troops are the ones closest to the Kuwaiti border. It essentially gets tougher as you get closer to the capital, right?
Well, the Iraqi defense makes a lot of sense. They basically decided to exploit the home court advantage is one way you can look at it. Saddam is based his own defense in Baghdad, and Baghdad is his fortress, and he's tried to turn it into a kind of a bastion. And he has, in terms of ground forces, he has his Special Republican Guard, which defends the city proper, and then 3 Republican Guard divisions arrayed around it, let's say within about 50 miles. And he stacked most of his air defense there. And that's where he's making his final stand. Now, everything up to that, the function of all these other units is simply to slow down the American advance and cause the Americans to lose a bit of momentum. But the decisive battle is around Baghdad. Now, what happened last night was, in terms of U.S. air power, is they decided to take the air war to Baghdad with this so-called shock and awe campaign that they're promoting. And it may have had an important effect in terms of morale and the Iraqi ability to command and control their forces. On the other hand, it's not exactly the first time the Iraqis have seen American air power in action. They endured 43 days of it during the Gulf War. They had it during Desert Fox during the Clinton administration. So, I think what's happened now is, they've done the air campaign in Baghdad. in a way that they're trying to unsettle the regime and hit key targets without laying waste to the city. Because I guess there was the old sign they used to have: you break it, you buy it. And I think the American military is also conscious of that. Every bridge they destroy in Baghdad is a bridge that U.S. military and U.S. taxpayers are going to have to rebuild, and they try to govern the city. So they're trying to do it in a way that pushes the regime off the edge without wiping the city off the map. And I've seen some of the target maps because I'm embedded under all sorts of restrictions as to what I can report. And I have to say that, there's big red splotches in some very key parts of the city, and then whole areas that will be completely untouched. So they're trying to do it in this discriminate way. But the point is that the next few days are really decisive, because that's when we're going to learn how formidable an opponent or not formidable the Republican Guard will be. There's no question about the outcome. The U.S. will win this. The question is, at what cost?
Michael, thank you very much. It's good to talk to you under any circumstance, especially nice to talk to you tonight. Michael Gordon is Chief Military Rights. I don't know that is precisely the title, but that is the job for the New York Times. A distinguished and very much experienced writer of military matters for the Times. He's at Camp Doha, which in country in Kuwait is the principal command center. General Wes Clark is here. Ken Pollock is here. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on a division that doesn't mean a whole lot, and their surrender doesn't mean a whole lot. So tell me now if we need to, both of you, I guess the General will start with you, if we need to spend any more time really talking about the importance of the 51st, this group that surrendered today.
It's a warm-up drill. Shows us we got a process, shows us we can talk to them. It's warming up and how to deal with the surrender. It's warm-up.
Ken, any significance? I know you know a fair amount about this group. Any significance that you see to this we ought to note before we move on?
Yeah, I think just to take out the point that there are two ways to look at this. First, from Saddam's perspective, as Michael Gordon was basically getting at, I don't think this is a big deal for Saddam. He never expected the 51st Mechanized Division to put up much of a fight to us. I think any amount that they could slow us down, inflict some casualties, that's a bonus for Saddam. As Michael was suggesting, he really believes the battle's going to be decided in Baghdad, and we shouldn't take their surrender as being necessarily a sign that the fight at Baghdad isn't going to be a tough one, or that Saddam might be changing his mind. But by the same token, it does indicate to us that our initial assumptions about how the Iraqis would fight seem to be correct so far. And it's important, so far, the initial estimates were that the regular Army divisions probably wouldn't put up much of a fight and that we would see large-scale surrenders, and this seems to be confirming that pattern.
Well, just taking what all of you who know these military things a lot better than I do, honestly, what all of you have said is it also sounds to me as if it also confirms to a certain extent what the Iraqi military figured would happen, because they didn't have much confidence in the 51st either, General.
They didn't have any way of really supporting this force down there. They knew it was there, it served a purpose, it maintained control over the Shia Muslims and prevented them from sort of breaking away in advance. It was a sacrifice play.
And just one other point, it seems to me that we all, and I mean we all, you watching us here, need to keep in mind, we see this enormous effort made in the air campaign today. This is the American, this is the, if Michael, using Michael Gordon's term, the home field advantage is the city of Baghdad for the Iraqis. The Americans own the sky. This is what the Americans do very, very well, with precision, with power. This is their strong suit. This thing gets nastier as it goes, and no one should get the sense, based on what happened today, that this thing's a slam dunk. It's over, and you know, everybody's coming home a week from Thursday, because nothing that happened today suggests that, right?
That's true. But I think, as I listen to Michael talk, and I don't know how Ken would feel about this, but I think Saddam's made a significant strategic mistake here in thinking that he can draw back into a home field advantage. As long as we control the sky, we have the high ground. And with the air power that we have today, what we can see, we can hit. What we can hit, we can destroy. And we can do it without any losses. And so wherever they make a stand, unless it's in a civilian populated area, they're going to be destroyed.
Aaron,
go ahead, Ken.
if I just add something to what General Clark said, I think he's absolutely right, and I think it's something important to keep in mind for the future, which is I think that Saddam has made a tremendous mistake about the strategy. You can say, I think you can make a very good case that really this is the only strategy, the only option that Saddam has available to him. But nevertheless, he's done what we've seen him do time and again in the past, which is convince himself that this strategy is going to work. He is very optimistic, as far as we can tell right now, because he thinks this strategy is going to work, even though you hear experts like General Clark, and I think pretty much anyone who knows anything about military forces would say it's highly unlikely that it will work. Saddam continues to believe it. And in the days ahead, we've got to remember that. We've got to remember Saddam's ability to convince himself of what it is that he wants to believe.
Let me throw a couple questions out then as we go here. I mean, I know we'd sort of end up in a discussion on strategy exactly, but that's sort of the way it works in these things. We've got some graphics that can help us. Okay, let's take for a second, General, the notion that this was a lousy strategy. Did keep your eye on the monitor too, if you don't mind. Did Saddam have many options in terms of strategy?
Well, probably not. I mean, if he didn't have enough strong, reliable forces to defend the perimeter of the country.
So these outlying places we see on the map, Mosul in the north and down to the south, he didn't have enough of an army, if you will.
That's right.
But he didn't have enough guys. I mean, it's an army that has been degraded a lot since the Gulf War.
That's right. I mean, he put most of his best forces into Kuwait the last time. He lost half of the force in 1991, and that was just in Kuwait and right around Kuwait, and he pulled back out of Kuwait. Now, trying to guard Kuwait, guard the north, protect the west from Jordan, just didn't have enough forces. So he's been driven into this strategy. He really had only, he has one key trump card, and that is the chemical and biological weapons. And let's hope, for the sake of the world, that he doesn't use them.
Now, that's the other thing. I mean, there's been a lot of putting gas masks on and putting gas masks off. But again, this is early in the game, if you will, use the term advisedly. It's no game out there. There's nothing to say that we won't see these weapons as more American forces and British forces come into the country. There's no guarantee that that's not going to happen. Ken, do you pretty much agree that he didn't have many options? This is an army that's been almost literally begging for spare parts to try and hold itself together.
Yeah, I mean, Aaron, the honest answer is he did have a different strategy available, but it wasn't a military strategy. It was a diplomatic strategy. I mean, I think the right strategy for Saddam is he should have turned his country inside out and disarmed completely. I mean, the honest answer is he should have done that back in 1991. If he had done it in 1991, he'd probably have a nuclear weapon by now. But this time around, he should have seen us coming, and he should have done everything that he possibly could have to get rid of all the weapons that he did have, turn them all over to the weapons inspectors to foreclose this attack, to prevent it from ever occurring. But again, he convinced himself that he did have this military option, this military fallback position, and therefore he felt like he could continue to play around with the inspectors and not fully disarm. And I think he made a tremendous mistake.
The would have and should haves of life, the all clear siren has gone off in Baghdad for as long as that last daylight. General, quickly on this point, since we're looking at the picture, the American forces, the British forces, the air forces would prefer not to attack in daylight, but they could.
Well, we're probably attacking elsewhere in Iraq in daylight.
Okay.
This is where the majority of the air defense is. Probably want to give it one more night of working over before we go there, but eventually we'll be going over Baghdad in daylight.
Okay, because at some point they've taken out enough of the anti-aircraft.
Right.
Okay. Now, David, go back to the graphic that we put up. Let's try and explain. This is a kind of look at how this effort might play out. General, I'll let you do this. You do this for a living.
Well, what you've got here is you've got the forces moving north. Right now we've got two major thrusts. The 7th Cav, which is the advance guard of the 3rd Infantry Division.
That's that group we followed last night.
And they're up there right now somewhere around the main road. They're near the Euphrates River, apparently near the town of An-Nasiriyah, according to the press reports. And on the right flank is the 1st Marine and the combination of the 1st Marines and the British. Out there in H2 and H3, we're there. We're not quite sure what's there. Some of the press reporting would indicate maybe a brigade of the 82nd might be there. Some fairly tough fighting. We had some British Special Forces in there, maybe Rangers. And in the north, reports that the Iraqis would like to surrender. If we can get up there, we'll accept their surrender.
Got to get up there. There's a group up there that wants to give up and has nobody to give up to.
So far. So we've got to get some forces leapfrogging from H2 and H3 up into that area. Then we put the squeeze on, we close in around Baghdad, and at the same time, this air power is not idle. And once it's worked over the air defense and command and control, then those Republican Guard divisions that are out there guarding the approaches of Baghdad, the day of the orange-painted tank in the desert is over. And they're out there, they're visible, they'll be taken out one by one.
There is, again, to use Michael Gordon's term, a home court advantage. There's also a home court disadvantage in that the, excuse me, the environment, the countryside itself, there's just, if you're out in the desert, there's no place to hide.
Now there's built-up areas in
the bottom of a shoe. Many of you, actually dozens and dozens of you, saying, well, Saddam Hussein must, and these people must be watching the news, they see this shoe thing. Well, that's not exactly the truth. In the Arab world, to give a thumbs-up signal is a very bad thing to do. I learned that the hard way. It is one of those gestures similar to the middle finger, maybe, for an American. Not quite as severe, but it's close. The other thing is, when you cross your legs, you make a point never to show the bottom of your shoe, because that is insulting to anyone who comes by. It says basically, you should be put down, I am better than you, you are trampled in my presence. The bottom of a shoe is significant socially, at least, thus the hitting of it with the bottom of the shoe, and thus that comment. You may remember one other slam that was leveled at the United States and at the Allies a time back, when they said, may shame come upon your mustache, which basically means may there be dishonor to your family and all whom you love. The colloquialisms are not always easily understood, but a little bit of brain room research and they can usually be figured out. I've just gotten word that air raid sirens are yet again sounding inside Baghdad. Let's listen and see if we can hear them. Often when you get these reports of air raid sirens, it's instead the all clear. They have two distinct sounds. A long and piercing one-tone siren means an all clear. It's possible that that was the case, and they don't last as long, so we're anticipating at least that that might be what it was after two recent reports of two recent bombings. Two explosions to the south and east of Center City, one other large explosion. Both of those two incidents, three explosions altogether, produced ambulances coming through the streets, but nothing from our cameras. So that is about the latest that we can report as we now approach 10:30 here in the east, 7:30 in the west, and 6:30 a.m. in Baghdad, where a new day has dawned, and there is hope at least for surrender talks. It is our understanding that surrender talks have been going on at some level, that they have gotten promises of surrender from some, but not from all, and certainly not from the right people. Therefore, for now at least officially, the bombing campaign will continue 24 hours a day. And as Brett Baer just reported from the Pentagon, more than 1,000 cruise missiles, more than 1,000 Tomahawk missiles have fallen upon different sections of Iraq, 3 times the total number which fell during the entirety of the first Persian Gulf War. Watching this closely across the border are the people of Kuwait, who were the target, obviously, of Saddam Hussein's aggression before, and in this case have great fears that Saddam might target the Kuwaitis yet again out of a lack of anything else to target. Our correspondent Adam Housley has been watching over things from our newsroom.
Also saying, as we reported yesterday, only 9 wells have been sabotaged thus far. The waterways are a major effort to keep them open. The southeastern part of Iraq, 139 floating sea mines have been located and secured. Asked quite directly as to whether or not the coalition forces have found evidence of weapons of mass destruction. Bit of an evasive answer, not quite clear from Tommy Franks, but he did say quite pointedly later, there is no doubt, he says, no doubt that Saddam Hussein's regime has weapons of mass destruction. A lot of talk, too, about whether or not the Iraqi leader is still alive. When asked that question, pretty frank as well from Tommy Franks, saying I don't know. At one point, he stressed the fact that this military plan is flexible and it has to stay that way, and I believe we saw that on Wednesday night when we saw the first cruise missiles go into central and southern Baghdad about 2 hours before that 48-hour ultimatum deadline was issued from the White House. Again, the pictures from Baghdad from our CNN crew fed in a short time ago. And as we watch those, we go back to New York. And again, here's Paula.
Bill,
Paula?
we're going to stay with that picture and add a little more to what you've just said because we have the time. General Tommy Franks describing the start of the shock and awe part of this campaign is going exceptionally well. He said the targeting has been precise, that all precise munitions have been used, and that no targets selected were inappropriate. He said the Baghdad targets chosen, or that were chosen to avoid non-combatants. We're going to stay with this picture as we talk with General Shepard because this is probably the clearest idea of how specific this video showing us how specific these targets are and were yesterday about 1 p.m. Eastern time. General Shepard, the Iraqis are saying that 19 missiles hit their sites. Have you been given any suggestion that it is actually more than that?
Paul, I have. Some of the information we have is that there were 39 targets struck in this complex, and multiple weapons were employed on many of these targets. As I just look and count the impacts there, it looks to me like a lot more than 19. But I'll make one point. This has been referred to by many people as the bombing of downtown Baghdad. That's partially true. This is in downtown Baghdad, but it's a confined area on the western bank of the Tigris River, the governmental and military area of the west bank of the Tigris River there. So it's a very confined area, and I suspect it'll be struck again, Paul.
The other thing I want you to talk about as we continue to look at these exclusive pictures I wasn't even aware that we had, as Nick Robertson and his crew were expelled from Iraq. They captured this from their hotel balcony before they made it to the Jordanian border. The two words that I heard General Tommy Franks use a number of times were agile and flexibility, and describing this plan and the number of actions that can happen at the same time. What is it that we should expect?
Well, I'll give you an example of what he's talking about. He had planned, according to the information we have, to basically launch the air campaign, the shock and awe campaign first, and to be followed simultaneously but behind the air campaign with the ground war. Because of the setting on fire of the oil wells, he launched the ground campaign first, and then several days later, or rather a couple days later, the shock and awe of the air campaign. So he was flexible enough to do that. And the other flexibility he demonstrated was the emerging leadership target, the decapitation target, that took but a few hours to basically organize, get the approval, and then get all the munitions flowing en route. So I believe that's what he was talking about in the flexibility. And what he's also saying is, hey, it's going to take as long as it's going to take. There is no necessary timeline. If we get slow in one area, we may move fast in another, but we have the flexibility to do that. That's the way I read it, Paula.
General Shepard, we're going to try to look at some of the images we saw during this news conference for you to explain their relevance. There was a shot at one point where General Franks was describing a tugboat that was carrying oil drums of having been taken out. Actually, this isn't the specific image, but this image we can learn from as well. And he talked about how blowing up that boat prevented the release of 139 mines.
Yeah, what you just saw there, you were looking at was the missile sites and the missile control vehicle there that I believe was struck. And the tugboat had 139 mines on it. It was sunk, as we saw by those, had a secondary explosion that essentially blew it apart, probably a lot of the mines exploding. Now, had you had those 139 mines unleashed in the lower part of the Qasr port there, the port would have been unusual for ingoing and outgoing oil on the outgoing side, and then humanitarian supplies on the incoming side that are essential to reconstructing Iraq. So the interception of this tugboat was a major, major plus. Also, a lot of the approach channels throughout the Gulf are very, very narrow, and if you sunk a major ship in any of those approach channels, you would have a major problem on your hand. So the Coast Guard and naval forces of the coalition are really being on watch for this type of thing to keep the mines out of the area.
General Shepard, do you mind standing by? We need to take a short break here. Just a final footnote here. When asked about whether Saddam Hussein was still alive, General Frank says, "I have no idea." And then he eventually went on to say in an answer to another question that the mission would not change if Saddam Hussein is dead. Now, the other thing reporters ask him about is, what can you tell us about these so-called secret talks going on between defectors and allied officials with current Iraqi leaders? And all he would basically say is those are ongoing, and he wouldn't tell us much more than that. We're going to take a short break. Our Strike on Iraq coverage continues right after that.
Convention relating to the treatment of prisoners of war. Any Iraqis who violate the conventions will be considered war criminals and will be treated as such. Coalition forces are currently holding thousands of Iraqi prisoners of war, and they are being treated humanely and in full accordance with the Geneva Convention. This arises for a couple of reasons, Tony. In this videotape, these U.S. personnel are clearly being interrogated. It is a violation of Article 13 of the Geneva Convention passed in 1949 to subject any prisoner of war to any intimidation or expose them to what is described as public curiosity. The Red Cross in Geneva has already issued a statement on this, saying it disagrees with the treatment of these prisoners as portrayed on this videotape, and also considers it a violation of the Geneva Convention. But the key statement from a senior defense official: any Iraqis who violate the Geneva Convention will be considered war criminals and will be treated as such. Tony, back to you.
All right, Major Garrett, thank you very much. Some other breaking news. There's been considerable controversy, as you know, in the United States and its dealings with its allies. We have had a great deal of difficulty getting the French, the Russians, and the Germans even to acknowledge the need for going after Saddam Hussein. There have been allegations that among the other reasons for that reluctance on the part of those allies has been commercial interest. It turns out now that there may be a very disturbing commercial interest on the part of the Russians. A Washington Post piece today talks about some sales that have been discussed in sort of fragmentary fashion in the past in the press, and that is selling militarily significant and sensitive equipment, the Russians selling it to the Iraqis. This would include thousands of night vision goggles. The Iraqis did not have night vision equipment on a par with the United States. In addition, it also included a series of different jamming devices that might in fact cause precision-guided munitions to go astray. In effect, as we pointed out before, taking precision munitions that normally would hit military targets and perhaps causing them to go into civilian areas. There is no use for this equipment other than to place civilians in harm's way. Now, in response to that story, in today's Washington Post, the State Department spokeswoman, Brenda Greenberg, has issued the following statement. Just gotten it, so I'm going to read it off this sheet of paper. We are very concerned about reports that Russian firms are selling militarily sensitive equipment to Iraq. Such equipment in the hands of the Iraqi military may pose a direct threat to U.S. and coalition armed forces. We regard this as a very serious matter and thus have raised it with the Russian government at very high levels over the past 2 weeks. The response so far has not been satisfactory. We hope the responsible Russian agencies will take our concerns seriously. Now, this is not a new matter. There are a series of acts that have been passed by Congress in recent years that prohibit Russian sales of technologies to such countries, including Iran, where it has evidently sold equipment that will enable the Iranians to put together a nuclear reactor capable of producing material that may in fact go into nuclear weapons. We will continue to bring you more on this story. It's a very important diplomatic development. Our Terry Schultz has just come in with that report. Now joining us on the phone, talking about a story that has all Americans concerned today, the taking of POWs by the Iraqis and possibly grotesque violations of the Geneva Convention. Joining us to talk about that from Arizona, a man who knows this all too well, a former POW, U.S. Senator from Arizona, John McCain. Senator McCain, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Tony.
Let's talk first about the government response, which has been very swift. And we also had Jeffrey Zahn on earlier, a POW during the Gulf War, who said he considers it important that the United States government repeatedly and vigorously make it clear that whoever is responsible for this is going to pay a price.
Absolutely. That's the only thing they understand, and one of the reasons why all of our POWs are all but one. There's still a question about a Navy commander, as you know, but one of the reasons why they were not treated worse than they were, and in many cases they were treated badly but were not killed, is because of that threat of reprisals. So I think the immediate reaction of our government that they will be held responsible for any violations of the Geneva Conventions, I hope and I believe, is probably likely to have a salutary effect, because I don't think there's many of them that think they're going to win this war.
Senator McCain, you've just heard me reading the story, excuse me, about Russian arms sales. We've also had another sign of French opposition, not merely to the war, but even post-war reconstruction last week by Jacques Chirac. What do you make of all this diplomacy? There's been an argument on Capitol Hill that we could have averted war if diplomacy had worked. I'll ask you a question I asked earlier today of Richard Gephardt. Can you see any circumstance, given the public stance and the private behavior of these governments, where diplomacy possibly could have worked?
No, in a word. Could I just, for 1 second, return to the POW thing? Just one comment. The families are obviously very concerned now. Understandably, they're terribly concerned. These young people are well trained. They are prepared. They will act with courage. They are in good physical condition, and all of us are proud of them, and we know that they will perform admirably under these most difficult conditions, and they will come home. And the family should take comfort that they are serving their country in a noble cause. Now,
Senator McCain, I'm going to double back and follow up on that, and then we can go to the Russians and French, because you're absolutely right. One of the things that I think people are going to begin to see as this engagement continues is the quality of fighting forces. Embedded reporters all of a sudden have had the scales fall from their eyes. Many of them, of course, had some experience with the military. But they're going to get a chance to see not only the courage and the character and the training of our troops, but also the fact that the United States, unlike anybody we've ever come up against, still has a fairly humane approach to war, if one can talk of such a thing, and that we try to the very best of our abilities not to harm innocent people, including in some cases conscripts of an army run by a tyrant.
Including putting the lives of American fighting men and women in greater risk because of our dedication to preventing as much as possible civilian deaths. And again, I want to assure the families, the Iraqis know that they're not going to win this war. They know it's going to be short, and so take comfort. But anyway, I get a little emotional. But back on the Russian thing, Tony, I think you're going to find that significant financial dealings were conducted between the French and the Iraqis, and not that long ago. Mr. Chirac and the French government were directly involved in the sale of the nuclear reactor that the Iraqis built back in '81 and the Israelis hit. And we criticized the Israelis at the time, if you might remember, and then we've been praising them ever since. So I think there were significant financial dealings between the French and the Iraqis, and this new information about the Russians certainly doesn't come as a shocking surprise, does it?
No, but let me get your personal reaction to it.
Well, I think it's disgraceful. I think that what this Russian government is doing in a number of areas, not just this, but their brutal repression of the Chechen people, which to some degree we haven't given as much attention or concern about because of our desire to have overall good relations with the Russians. Remember, let's not forget that Mr. Putin's career was spent as a KGB agent. So his ideas of international dealings and other things and respect for human rights may be somewhat different from ours. And I think we should keep that in mind when we're dealing with the Russians. And I think that if it proves to be true, and obviously one article does not prove it, but if it proves to be true that they sold the Iraqis equipment which caused the deaths of Americans, that has got to have a significant effect on U.S.-Russia relations.
Do you think there ought to be trade sanctions? It's a dicey weapon to use, but a lot of times when people violate these sort of things, there is a regime of sanctions that kicks in. What do you think we ought to do with the French and Russians or other nations that in open defiance of UN resolutions to which they paid lip service, they violated?
First of all, I think in the case of this Russian sales, I think we'd have to find out the extent of it. And, you know, I mean, rather than rush to judgment, I couldn't prescribe a specific response. But as you said, there are laws on the books that Congress has passed over the years, both Democratic and Republican Congresses, that call for certain reprisals in the case of certain infractions. I would certainly hope those would be enforced, and I would fully expect them to be. And second of all, if you let them get away with it, then how are we going to conduct our war on terrorism if countries that are supposed to be our friends are giving equipment to other countries which could easily fall into the hands of terrorists? So I think it's an important issue, and I think we're going to be, given our intelligence capability and, frankly, the ability of our media, we may be hearing a lot about this in the future. And as far as the French are concerned, I was asked on another program this morning, well, how are we going to improve our diplomatic relations with the French? I think the answer is, how are the French going to improve their diplomatic relations with us? We didn't offend the French. We didn't give our word to their secretary, their foreign minister, that we wouldn't veto a resolution as the French foreign minister promised Colin Powell after the passage of 1441. We haven't said that we will block any resolution concerning post-Saddam Iraq before there's even a resolution proposed. Look, they're going to have to do some soul searching, and I'm already hearing some indications that maybe some of the French people are not overjoyed at this behavior on the part of their government.
All right, Senator John McCain, a wide-ranging interview with us, and I want to thank you, and especially for the words of comfort to the families of the POWs. I know they appreciate that more than anybody can express. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. See you. Bye.
Now, joining us with a reaction from the Central Command headquarters in Doha, Qatar, to the taking of POWs, or at least what people believe now at this point is the taking of American POWs, standing by at CENTCOM headquarters, Mike Tobin. Mike?
Well, Tony, there's a real sickened feeling running through here at the media center at Central Command after seeing that absolutely horrible video. One of the soldiers watching the video screen said simply that it feels unreal. He didn't have the right words to describe how he was feeling. Another U.S. Marine said he was absolutely outraged because he knows that there are mothers and fathers and loved ones of these soldiers who are going to ultimately see this video of them, and it's absolutely horrible. One of the soldiers said they have been taught over and over again that in the event that they were taken prisoner, that they are only to give out basic information. And that is what we are hearing from the soldiers on the tape. They are giving out information about their unit. They're giving out, for the most part, they're only giving out their first names and giving out the towns where they are from. One of them said they're peppered with questions as far as, were you greeted with flowers or guns when you arrived here? They didn't get a clear answer. One of them asked,
we don't know how this is going to come out, except we can be pretty certain that there's going to be a regime change.
Colonel Turner, I want to bring you back in, but first I want to go to General Dawkins. Carl brings up a terrific point, and I was thinking back to Afghanistan. Remember that period when some of the biggest critics of the presidents were the conservatives on the right, who said he wasn't prosecuting the war strongly enough. They were losing all sorts of opportunities, and lo and behold, we started to take Mazar-e Sharif, and the rest of them just followed like dominoes. Is there a danger, as Carl said, of judging the war by the battles and not the overall war?
Well, absolutely, and I think Carl makes a terribly important point. And that is, not only do you have to look at it over a longer time frame, but you have to appreciate what having embedded correspondence with the units is. What that does is gives you a tremendous sense of the texture of what's actually going on at the point of contact.
Yeah.
What it doesn't do is allow you to generalize. So one mistake I think you have to be very careful to guard against is to indeed project that sense of reality, that sense of detail, that sense of the texture of the reality of what's going on, but understand that they're looking through a tiny peep sight. They're looking through a tiny little one facet of this whole universe of the war. And so part of, I think, what programs like this have the responsibility to do is to put that in the right perspective, in the right context, and allow people to weave a fabric, a coherent fabric of what's really going along.
Well, part of that responsibility really falls on the shoulders of the military as well. And Colonel Turner, I'll bring you back in. When you were briefing Colonel Schwarzkopf, telling him how to debrief the reporters there, what were you telling him about this specific point? Look, don't jump to conclusions about a particular battle. Don't judge the war by what happens in this particular instance. You have to step back. How do you do that?
Well, it's pretty interesting, David. Actually, I was responsible in the morning after the midnight shift for sitting down with General Neal. If you remember, he was the Central Command spokesperson. And I would pull the raw data in off the air, land, and Navy desks, and we would go over that together and say, all right, what exactly will give a broad picture? Now, the press was not happy with that system. They didn't like that system, and they felt like they were not being given sufficient information, and yet it was interesting to see the raw data come in, watch how we could craft what we thought was a fair and equitable picture, and we put out some fratricide incidents fairly unvarnished, and then see what actually was reported and what came out. The difference between this system and that system was you got about 10% of the information. It was a good 10%, and we felt it was a representative 10%. The media didn't like that because we were the ones calling the shots on which 10% it was. And frankly, I really have to laud everybody that has put the embedded system together. I think it's a superb system. One point I would make, which it sort of speaks to the General's point, is that so far we've had a notably successful operation. This embedded program could be presenting some pretty horrific images in the near term, and we need to be prepared for that. There are some turns that the war could take where the embedded photography and footage, the real-time footage, could be pretty frightening, and so we need to be prepared for that.
Carl Bernstein, back to you for a second. Let me just make sure if I understand. You think that there may be too much information, that because of all of the information sources that folks have at their availability, whether it's in the internet or cable news, that may not be a good thing?
No, no, no. I think that we have to be discerning, and I think that viewers particularly need to step back, but I think also those of us who are covering the story need to step back and remember what the nature of news itself is. You know, news reporting is really the first rough draft of history. It's what you got on the ground at the moment. But let's take a look at what the repercussions of a story like this are. I did a story, the first story I ever did as a television reporter in 1980, saying that the United States, China, Pakistan, and Egypt had formed a secret alliance to supply the Mujahideen rebels in Afghanistan with arms to fight the Soviets. The story sank like a stone at the time. Obviously, it's a tremendously important story, and we're dealing with the repercussions of it today. All we can tell right now is what we see in front of our face and try to make some conclusions about it and take a little bit of a longer view. At the same time, this story that is going on in Iraq today is one of the biggest stories of our time. It represents a whole new area of diplomacy. We have no idea what the world is going to look like after this war 5 years from now, any more than we could have foreseen that supplying those Mujahideen rebels with those arms, one, would be the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union because they lost Afghanistan and they got into a quagmire, and two, that those same weapons and those same Mujahideen would turn on us and we would be in a situation with those terrorists today who we armed in the first place. So what I'm suggesting is this war is the beginning of a huge story with huge repercussions for our next 10 years, 25 years, what our relationships are in Europe, what our relationships are in the Arab world, what's going to happen in the Middle East with Israel. All of this is going to be affected by this event, so that we can't be too myopic about what we're seeing. And even in the war itself, let's not get too myopic on a 24-hour basis.
Understood.
That's all I'm saying. And the embedded reporting is a great thing, and the Pentagon is to be congratulated, and the reporters out there are demonstrating once again that the American press can be trusted with issues of national security without disclosing secrets. We have a great record on this, and we continue to, and it's always been a red herring to throw at the press the idea that we are going to endanger national security in
well, the main thing is that now you have this tremendous variety that we can look at and choose from and decide for ourselves as informed public which among the many views are the correct, or the amalgam of the total is correct. We don't want to forget the home front. We've been talking a lot about what's going on overseas. That's understandable, but we have been threatened here at home. We've been attacked here at home. That's what this is all about. We want to talk about national security now with Miami Police Commissioner John Timity. He joins us. Commissioner, thank you for hanging on and staying with us.
Oh, my pleasure, Dave.
I want to ask how the war has affected your view of your job.
Well, clearly before the war, we were on these various states of alert based on a color code coming out of Washington. And what that meant, particularly at the color orange, it meant additional resources, police officers at fixed locations, and a whole host of other things. However, the war now in the last week has added another dimension, if you will. As you saw across America yesterday and last week, mass demonstrations which require hundreds and in some cases thousands of police officers to police those demonstrations, which require police officers being taken away from regular police work, but also in the area of anti-terrorism. And so we've got to be real careful as we move forward. The other thing, hopefully this war is over shortly and that it doesn't drag out, but as Carl Bernstein says, who knows what's going to happen later on. If you remember, the protests back in the 60s started off as peaceful protests against the Vietnam War, but spitting out of that, if you will, a whole host of almost fifth columns, the weather underground, people who try to bring down the government from within. And so there are all those potentials out there that we must be aware of.
Well, let me just talk about one of the potentials that we heard about last week, this report of Iraqis crossing the border from Mexico into the United States.
Yeah.
Give us an example, using that as an example of how you coordinate your activities with those of national services.
Yeah, well, as you're well aware, most of the major cities in America have membership, and we do also, on the FBI's terrorist task force, and it involves the local, state, and federal police, but also the alphabet soup of federal agencies, the Coast Guard, the INS. And so we work hand in hand on a daily basis. Prior to 9/11, the communication had not been all that great. It's improved, but there are still gaps that need to be filled in. That's number one. Number two, not just the border on Mexico and on Canada, but you know, I went up in a chopper about a month ago viewing the coastline of South Florida.
Oh, yeah.
And when you look down, you begin to realize how vulnerable we are. You know, day after day, boats come in from Cuba and Haiti with illegals into South Florida.
Not to mention the drug smugglers.
Not to mention the drug smugglers. And so when you look from the air and you see the thousands of ships along the coastway, you realize what a daunting task it is for the Coast Guard and from Immigration and Naturalization Service to police, if you will, our borders.
Now, the community, you know, we're all nervous out there. We're not afraid, as Britt Hume reminds us, but we are nervous. Right. And sometimes nerves are a good thing, because you can use that nervous energy and empower yourself to do things that ordinarily you couldn't do. How are you trying to address that? How are you trying to direct the nervous energy of your community into proactive activity to help you out and maybe even track down terrorists in your midst?
Yeah. Well, on a variety of levels. One, for the average citizen, you know your neighborhood, you know where you do business, and when things seem out of the ordinary, there may be a good reason for it, and by all means call the local police. The business community, whether it's the hotels or the large corporations with large office buildings, usually have a pretty sophisticated security staff. They work hand in hand now with the local authorities, much closer than they ever did in the past. And so combining, if you will, the private security along with regular citizens, whether it's citizens on patrol or just people in the neighborhood, keeping, you know, a sharp eye about. You can't be overly nervous. You must resume life as normal as possible.
Yeah, but however, as John Walsh has said, you know, if every American knew their neighbor, if every decent American knew their neighbor and reported wild stuff into the police, we would have every terrorist cell in America.
That's true, but sometimes what looks like suspicious activity upon investigation turns out to be easily explainable. We had a whole host. I was the Philadelphia Police Commissioner back in September 11th, and for about 4 or 5 weeks after September 11th, we were inundated, as was every other major department, with thousands of phone calls that we had to check out. On the face, they looked very suspicious, particularly post-anthrax scare. It looked very suspicious, but once it was checked out, it often disappeared to nothing. However, out of those thousands of phone calls by citizens, some, in fact, did pan out.
Well, Chief, yeah, and Florida, you know, of course, we've had a lot of incidences in Florida where there have been characters that turned out to be up to no good. Arab Americans, the Arab American community is unique in the fact that it speaks the language of the terrorists, it has the same religion and so forth. Have you gone out of your way to recruit the help of Arab Americans in Florida?
Well, not so much here as I did in Philadelphia, because there was a rather large population of Arabs and Arab Americans. And I had, a lot of other chiefs felt the same way, that you can create a reservoir of goodwill and also good information in those communities. The vast majority of people who live in those communities are happy to be here in America, and in some cases are distressed. Sometimes people in those communities have information that can be of value, and the point is not to smear all Arabs with a broad brush, but to try and cultivate them, make them part, if you will, of the American dream. It's not in their best interest that terrorists that may come from their midst
no, the problem is that some of the bad guys were doing the organizing. I mean, there are a lot of these groups, like the Benevolence International and the Holy Land Foundation, that had this aura of being a good group, doing good for Muslims worldwide. In fact, they were hand in glove with the terrorists, and a lot of Muslim Americans were duped by these organizations that turned out to be part of the problem.
Well, I mean, one of the particular problems for American policing dealing with this issue is a lot of it is cloaked in religion, and we have a tendency in America, correctly so, to kind of leave religions alone, to give them great freedom and great latitude. Unfortunately, some people with evil intent have masked religion, if you will, and use it as a way to get some money that they now filter over.
Well, more than that, they've been using the pulpit to preach terrorism. I mean, that's these clerics, a lot of them funded by Saudi Arabians, have actually used their pulpit at their mosque to preach the terrorist talk.
No, you're absolutely right, and it's up to the individuals in those mosques to reject that notion if they are in fact true believers. Again, it just creates an extraordinarily difficult situation for local policing, because you don't want to be viewed as coming in and, if you will, squashing the rights of people to practice their religion openly. However, terrorists in this case, by the same token, shouldn't be allowed to use religion and religious institutions to cloak, their evil intent. Difficult situation.
Yeah. So, all in all, since the war has began, have you noticed any change in either internal activity in Miami or stuff that you've been preparing for?
I haven't noticed it, if you will, on the surface. However, I have had meetings with people of the Muslim faith, and at least outwardly there's been no disagreement. There was this notion that the people, for example, the 19 terrorists of September 11th, to the people that I meet and speak to, say in no way represent the teachings of the Muslim religion. However, it's a really dodgy situation. It's something really new for us. We've not really dealt with this in the past. Even, for example, in New York, where I originally came from, where there was, in certain parts of New York City, if you will, IRA sympathetic neighborhoods, that stuff would never have been tolerated in the local Catholic Church. And so there's a need for the mosques in any major city in America to make sure that the teachings that are going on are strictly religious teaching, that it's not dogma, that it's not political rhetoric, and certainly that it's not being used to get money to funnel to terrorists in Europe and places like that.
All right. Police Chief, and it's not Commissioner, it's Police Chief John Timoney. It was your old commissioner job that I was referring to.
There you go.
Thanks a million for joining us from Miami.
Thanks,
Appreciate you being here. We want to go back to General Pete Dawkins now, because there's a certain area of this whole conflict that we haven't talked about in Iraq specifically, which is the north. A lot of problems there, General Dawkins, and the first one that comes to mind is something that's actually outside of Iraq right now, or we assume it's so, which is Turkey. If Turkey sends its troops into Iraq, what do we do?
Well, if you'll forgive me, David, I'd like to go and start by outlining the issue as I see it with the Kurds.
If you could do it in a minute.
Okay, 1 minute. The Kurds live in parts of Turkey, parts of Iraq, and parts of Iran. They have ambitions geographically on their own. The Turks have fear of that kind of an activity because they have millions of Kurds in Turkey. So it's an example of the complexity of things in Iraq. There's nothing there I think we cannot handle, but it's got to be done very carefully. When Turkey decided not to allow us to station 60,000 troops there, it changed the whole war plan. Now I think we're going to have to work very delicately to prevent the Turks from insinuating themselves into northern Iraq, where they would frankly like to establish some control not only over the geography, but over the oil in that area.
Yeah, by the way, just as a point of order on all this, I had the Turkish ambassador on air during daytime about 2 weeks ago. He said absolutely not, Turkey is not going to send troops into Iraq. Was that a bald-faced lie, or have they changed their mind since then?
Well, as usual, and then again, this is an example of the complexity. They have had some smaller number of troops in Iraq all along. And if they just move a very small additional number in within that 12-mile buffer zone, I don't think it's a big issue. But if they take advantage of having given us rights, overflight rights, to then make an aggressive move into the northern part of Iraq, the Kurds will fight against the Turks, and then we have, you know, an element of civil war which complicates enormously our work there.
Well,
so,
you know that Tommy Franks has thought about this, and General Myers has thought about this. Do we actually want to place ourselves in the middle of that? Do we want to become the buffer between Turkey and the Kurds?
I think what we want to do is to preempt developments there that would lead to conflict between the Kurds and the Turks. And I'm confident that that's being worked very aggressively, and we may have to put part of our strategic reserve, perhaps part of the 101st or part of the 82nd up there, or part of the 173rd, in order to be a bit of a referee.
Yeah.
We certainly don't want to get between two warring factions, but we very much want to prevent there to be conflict between the Kurds and the Turks.
By the way, General Myers just today in his one of his conversations, I think it was on Fox News Sunday, said that we do have troops in northern Iraq. Now, if we couldn't bring them through Turkey, how do we get them in there? Did we drop them in, parachute them in?
I didn't hear General Myers' comment, but I assume we have special forces there. I assume we have special operating forces there. We may well have some advanced elements of units that we may bring in there. There's all kinds of ways, David, we can get people into that area without having to go through Turkey.
And the people themselves, if anybody, the Shia in the south of Iraq obviously have been repressed by Saddam, and the Kurds in the north, nobody suffered Saddam's tyranny more than they have. They're the ones that had to suffer those horrendous attacks, those chemical weapons attacks. Have we organized them? Can we organize them into a fighting force as we did in Afghanistan?
Well, I think that is happening right now. And they have, now they aren't a unified force, they aren't a conventional force in the way we think of it, but they have very good fighters, they have very disciplined groups, and they are very committed to the overthrow of Saddam. So they are an asset which we want to take advantage of. But again, the point, David, is in doing so, we got to make sure we don't complicate and work counter to our long-term desire, which is to have a unified and coherent Iraq that can be the foundation for a, really changed bit of political geography in that part of the world.
And I hate to suggest it, after all they've put us through in these past several months, the United Nations, Lord knows a lot of people would shake their heads and say it's the last thing in the world we need right now, but are they going to play a role in this somehow?
Well, I think initially probably not. There's an awful lot of hard feelings between the administration and the UN and a lack of trust and confidence. But longer term, there's going to have to be international oversight and international leadership of this, and we'll just have to see how that unfolds.
By the way, the very final point on the Republican Guard fighting from behind the backs of civilians in order to avoid being shot themselves. How do you deal with that as a soldier and a commanding officer?
Well, one is you're very happy that you don't have to put assassination squads behind your troops, but it does complicate the fact, and it means probably that more Iraqi soldiers will be killed than need to be killed because they're going to be forced to fight even when they don't want to.
We got to leave it at that. General Pete Dawkins, all the other people we've had on, Tom Graham, Julie Kurtz, Carl Bernstein, Mike Turner, and Commissioner Pete Timoney as well. We thank you all for joining us. That's it for this hour. Coming up right after this is our own Linda Vester with continuing coverage of Operation Iraqi Freedom. Stay tuned.
All right, last thing before I leave you, we've got the 3rd Infantry Division and I think a division of Marines knocking at the door of Baghdad, 50 miles away. What do we expect over the next couple days?
Well, I think we will expect that there will be more and more opposition from the heavy forces that are dug in. There are at least 3, perhaps 4 Republican Guard heavy divisions dug in, but the Special Republican Guard force is at least 15 to 25,000 strong, depending on how they have augmented the force. You will see much more fighting if Saddam remains alive and his inner circle remain alive, and some of these surrenders don't happen. You're going to see some very heavy fighting, and then our forces get stretched out pretty thinly because we don't have a lot of heavy forces that are in theater right now to move right up behind.
Lynn Todd, military planner on the staff of General Norman Schwarzkopf during Desert Storm. Mr. Todd, thanks a lot. The Marines are on the move, heading north. Rick Leventhal is traveling with the 1st Marines' 3rd Light Armored Reconnaissance Battalion.
A long convoy of Marines is on the move here in south-central Iraq. Because of operational security, we can't tell you where they're going, but there are many, many Marines in armored vehicles, in tanks, and armored personnel carriers that are heading for some very strategic locations. Meanwhile, the members of the 3rd Light Armored Reconnaissance Battalion, who we're embedding with, spent this day stocking up on fuel and food and water and rest. They need rest after a fierce firefight that we were involved in last night. We were traveling along a dark road headed for a strategic objective. The 3rd LAR then came under attack from more than 300 Iraqis, firing rocket-propelled grenades, mortars, and small arms at the Marines, who immediately fired back from their light armored vehicles with 25mm chain guns and machine guns and other weapons. Many of the Iraqis dismounted their vehicles and began running towards our convoy using sand dunes for cover, hopping up and down to get shots off. But the Marines won this battle. Well over 50 Iraqis were killed. The Marines suffered no casualties, but were surprised at the level of resistance they faced.
We lit them up. They hit the deck, but they continued to advance. They were within probably 50, 60 meters. So we just kept the fire up, and then the 25 right next to me, he let up his coax, and then they started to retreat finally.
So what was going through your mind last night? I hope I don't die. I hope I don't kill any friendlies. No fratricide. Hope everyone makes it out alive. A lot of my buddies were up, farther up, doing what the company push was doing. So, just hope everyone was all right. Someone told me it was your birthday yesterday. It was. It's quite a birthday party. Not really.
And this is one of the RPGs that the Marines recovered when they went back to the scene today. They tell me that if a round from one of these had hit one of these LAVs, it would have done some serious damage. With the Wolfpack in Iraq, Rick Leventhal, Fox News.
Our Rick Leventhal right up front, and of course our Greg Kelly with the 3rd Infantry Division also. Coalition forces are pressing toward Baghdad, as you have heard from our reporters, at an extremely rapid pace following several days of precise aerial bombing of the Iraqi capital that has taken out some key targets. The question now, will this early air campaign be a decisive factor in taking Baghdad? Joining us now, Robert Pape, a political science professor at the University of Chicago and the author of Bombing to Win, Air Power and Coercion in War. So, Mr. Pape, we're trying not to be second guessers since we're armchair quarterbacks, but what is the apparent intention of our bombing planners right now?
The big intention has been shock and awe. That is to win with air power, or almost air power alone, directed directly against Saddam Hussein's regime in an effort to win by decapitating Saddam's regime. This particular idea, leadership targeting, is not actually new in this particular war. Yes, it's true we're using more precision weapons against Saddam's regime than we have in the past, but not by 10 times, only perhaps by twice as many as we did in 1991. In 1991, we also tried to win with air power alone, with leadership targeting by targeting Saddam's regime. And in the first 3 days of Desert Storm, we opened with an air plan called Instant Thunder. That was the 91 version of shock and awe. And Instant Thunder hit 235 leadership and other strategic targets in and around Baghdad in the first 72 hours. Very similar to what we've done here. And also, unfortunately for us, it had very little effect. Just as we're seeing now, the opening effort to win with leadership targeting alone to decapitate the regime is not panning out.
Okay, but what about the precision bombing campaign against actual war targets, tanks, armored personnel carriers, masses of personnel?
The alternative to leadership targeting is what I call hammer and anvil, the use of air power and ground power together with the air hammer to smash into enemy ground forces, using the ground forces, our friendly ground forces, as an anvil so that we smash them and blow them to bits. What you've seen to this point is actually quite little hammer and anvil. And what's really been striking in the reports of the last 24 and 48 hours is how little tactical air forces have come in to help our guys out on the ground.
Okay, but there has been, and it is a consequence of international pressure, there has been this attempt to demonstrate the power we have and dump a ton of leaflets and radio broadcasts and TV broadcasts on these people to say, you know, stand down, surrender, come on over, we won't harm you. Does it appear that that attempt has now failed and hammer and anvil is probably up next?
I don't know. I hope hammer and anvil is up next. I have to say, although I wish I didn't have to say it, I think we have started to believe too much of our own rhetoric on those leaflets. Yes, it's true. We dropped 25 million leaflets on those units to get them to surrender. But what you're seeing now are routinely report after report of hundreds of Iraqi Republican Guard, irregular forces, and even regular Army forces who are contesting, that is, trying to use their weapons to kill our ground troops. That means these psychological operations, we just shouldn't put much stock in them.
Well, and I'm sure that if you and I can figure it out, the guys up front have figured it out, it doesn't appear to be working. So let's just say that they did the international community the favor of trying to get thousands of Iraqis to stand down and not get killed. It didn't work. It's time to bomb. We have Iraqi divisions in the field. What's going to happen?
Well, what I think we should do is I think we should actually move away from the bombing of Baghdad and targets in the center of other Iraqi cities, which is not actually helping us very much. And I think we should move that precision air power directly against forces that have been targeting our Marines and our Army troops on the ground. We've talked about the Mahabarabi Division. We've talked about the Medina Division of the Republican Guard. Apparently today our Apaches came under heavy assault from that division. I see no reason why we should be using precision air power against targets in Baghdad that aren't helping us much when we should be taking that air power right against the Medina Division.
Are you talking about carpet bombing the Medina Division?
If it's, I can't say without having looked at the terrain or where the Medina Division is actually located, the exact nature of the bombing against the Medina Division. What's quite striking, whether we carpet bomb or mass precision bomb, The key is using our air power directly against the Medina division.
Okay, my point is, and I'm speaking as a military novice, and I don't have much expertise, but when we do hear reports that hundreds, if not thousands, of individual Iraqi soldiers are standing up with their AK-47 and shooting at the Apaches, and that this, in its totality, presents a problem for these Apaches, don't you have to bomb so that individual soldiers are taken out? Not just tanks, not just APCs, not just mechanized divisions, but the individual soldier who's carrying a gun.
Yes, without doubt, that is the case. And without doubt, hammer and anvil will, when we talk about attacking the Iraqi army that is trying to attack our troops, we mean to attack the Iraqi troops as well as their weapons, because they are trying to kill our troops. I think in this case, the major thing that's not happening is not that we're being careful about bombing when we hit the Medina division. We're not bombing the Medina division at all.
Well, we shall see. My guess is that maybe we are, and taking good advice from Mr. Pape.
I hope you're right. I really hope you're right.
I hope I'm right, too. Robert Pape, author of Bombing to Win, Air Power and Coercion in War. Mr. Pape, thanks very much.
Glad to be here.
The 3rd Infantry Division is now 50 miles from Baghdad, and coalition air forces are targeting Saddam's Republican Guard from above. Correspondent Mike Tobin has more from Central Command in Qatar. Mike.
And, John, the one thing that everyone's talking about here are these pictures appearing on Abu Dhabi and Al Jazeera television, apparently showing the downed crew of this U.S. Apache that went down fighting outside of Baghdad in Karbala last night. I've seen the pictures myself. The crew does appear healthy at first glance. These do appear to be authentic pictures, and they are nothing like the pictures that appeared on Al Jazeera television yesterday, showing the mechanized division there that had been, or the maintenance division that had been ambushed, being harassed, and showing the bodies of what appeared to be dead U.S. soldiers. We have no comment from Central Command, from the official sources at Central Command, related to the pictures of what appear to be the crew of this Apache attack helicopter appearing on the Arab networks. Now, let's take you to live pictures of Baghdad, because we have new reports of bombing in Baghdad. At least 6 loud explosions were heard from downtown Baghdad. General Tommy Franks has characterized the bombings and cruise missile attacks in Baghdad as having been effective in terms of disrupting the ability of the command and control structure in the Iraqi military to communicate with its forces, but not eliminating the ability to communicate altogether. As you mentioned, for the first time, the Republican Guard divisions have been engaged by U.S. forces in an intense fight. General Franks characterized the progress thus far as rapid and dramatic, but he did not paint any sort of a rosy picture. He said U.S. forces have had hard days. They have more hard days again. One complication he talked about, Iraqis putting civilians in and around military targets when the coalition wishes to preserve civilian life. Here is General Franks on that.
Anytime you find, well, I guess I'll say perhaps criminal behavior of intentionally placing non-combatants in close proximity to military equipment and to military formations and so forth, then you certainly are abusing your people, and this regime has done that.
Back to the downed Apache, the pictures of the aircraft appearing on Iraqi television. The Apache apparently went down during an engagement, the first engagement of the Republican Guard, the Medina division, an intense firefight that involved the Apaches and multiple launch rocket systems. The Apache, a number of Apaches were shot down, or were shot, I should say. Pardon, let me correct myself. A number of Apaches were shot. This one went down. 2 different helicopters, one UH-60 and one Apache Apache went in an attempt to rescue the crew. They came under fire. They also pulled away. Now, much of the concern here, of course, devoted to the spotting on Abu Dhabi and Al Jazeera television of the crew right now, giving indications that the crew would be okay. All of this still remains to be authenticated. John?
Mike, you know, one of the things that happened over the weekend that everybody's concerned about, and maybe you've heard something around CENTCOM about how they're going to be dealing with this, is Americans faced with smiling Iraqis, waving as they go by, and as they go by, out comes the AK, and they are attacked from the rear or ambushed. What is the new American attitude in the field about the Iraqis they encounter?
You know, I posed that question directly to Lieutenant General John Abizade, and his position was it's kind of broad because all he said they could do is use more caution when approaching surrendering Iraqis, because you don't want to get into a situation where they say they're going to be more aggressive with the surrendering Iraqis for any number of reasons. So the coalition forces kind of have their hands tied. They know that some of these people are going to play possum, pull this ruse on them, then turn around and attack, but you still don't want to use excessive force when you're trying to peacefully take these people into custody and disarm them.
All right, Mike Tobin at CENTCOM headquarters in Doha, Qatar. Mike, thanks very much. U.S. pilots making runs over Iraq prepared for everything, including the worst-case scenario. Jamie Furlong reports from aboard the USS carrier U.S. Kitty Hawk.
For every pilot, as he or she prepares for a mission over Iraq, it is the unspoken nightmare scenario, brought down behind enemy lines. On the USS Kitty Hawk, a Navy-issue handgun, an optional item on every sortie, and it is an option most choose to exercise. In place of a multi-million-dollar aircraft in the skies, they will have to rely on their wits and training to survive on the ground amid hostile terrain. But amid all the in-flight gear that every pilot takes with them on every sortie over Iraq, there are some items they'll carry that they hope they will never have to use. Strapped to their bodies, each pilot carries a personal survival kit.
Here's this little extra pouch I carry. Again, water tablets, extra compass, extra rope, waterproof matches.
And they carry in their heads the training course they've completed, classified information which could make the difference between evasion or capture.
They teach you how to do, just as the name says, survive on whatever the land has to offer, to evade enemy forces, resist any enemy pressure applied to get information out of you.
The ship's Seahawk helicopters are among the first dispatched to the scene of a downed aircraft. A speedy rescue the aim. It doesn't always work out that way.
Because the last thing you want to do is eject through a cockpit of an aircraft and be in a parachute coming down in enemy territory and not having a plan and having to make a plan out there at that point.
And every safe touchdown signals another sortie where those skills can be held in reserve until the next time. On the USS Kitty Hawk, James Furlong, Fox News.
Sorties headed for tanks. A program note for Fox News Channel viewers. Tonight, we resume our primetime lineup of programming, Special Report, The Fox Report, The O'Reilly Factor, Hannity and Combs, On the Record with Greta Van Susteren, Total War coverage, fair and balanced tonight, tomorrow, and ad infinitum into the future. Let's go back now to Simon Marks in Amman, Jordan. Simon, you know, we've been talking to you for a long time there, and I'm really curious how this is going for you, trying to cover this war from what amounts to one of the frontline countries.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, John, because you're right, it does amount to a frontline country, but we are not on the front lines here. We're not, obviously, from Amman as engaged as some of my colleagues who are embedded with the US military, and we are not where we would all really like to be, of course, which is in Baghdad. It became simply too dangerous for us to stay in Baghdad, and many correspondents indeed, including some of my colleagues here on the Fox News channel, were actually expelled from Baghdad. So there's an inherent journalistic difficulty, in a sense, in standing in Amman and covering events that we cannot see, the bombing raids night after night in Baghdad. Our window on Baghdad, to some extent, is the very window that we're giving our viewers. Those pictures that you see of Baghdad, where we're sort of gathering around screens here, those of us who know the city, and saying, oh, I think I know that presidential palace, I think I know that government compound. It makes it somewhat difficult and, to some extent, a little bit frustrating, but there's no alternative. This is the way we have to do it.
Right, but Simon, you also have people around you who know Baghdad well, who've been there. The only reason they're not there now is, as you say, it got so dangerous, and so here we have a front row seat in Amman, and you have some expertise, and you have a fair number of Iraqis around you, not to mention Jordanians and Palestinians. Surely this is a valuable perspective.
Oh, no, there's no question about it. I mean, it's the second best perspective you can possibly have. It's not the best, but it's the second best, and it's a pretty close-run thing. I mean, we're also very lucky here in that this is genuinely a listening post. Not only can you keep your ear to the ground on the streets here and find out what Jordanians and that very sizable Palestinian community here in Jordan is saying, and they are often saying things that are very unpalatable to our viewers back in the United States, and that creates difficulties because often you're having to communicate news that people back at home in the United States may not welcome when they hear it. But also we have a plethora of sources at our disposal here. We've got a terrific team working with us who keep an eye on all those numerous Arab television stations, and there are dozens of them now, John. We talk a lot about Al Jazeera, but it's the tip of the iceberg. I was sitting down in our newsroom last night, and one of our assistant producers came up to me and said, oh, the television station that's operated by Hezbollah in Lebanon has just put out a breaking news alert. Who knew Hezbollah in Lebanon had its own television station? But in these days of the global village, it does.
Explain something to me. We've taken a lot of criticism from Al Jazeera. They've been more than anxious to put on images and stories which are harshly critical of the American war and the American intentions in Iraq. At the same time, the owner of Al Jazeera, the Emir of Qatar, it opened his country up to the American military to be used at will. Do we have a little schizophrenia going on here?
Well, I think there is a dichotomy here. I mean, Al Jazeera is a fascinating media organization. As much as it irritates and annoys and angers everybody back in the United States, it has also irritated and annoyed and angered governments all over this region. It has had several of its news bureaus closed down. Just the other day here, there was a story about King Abdullah welcoming home a Jordanian journalist who had gotten into terrible trouble for some things that he had said on Al Jazeera and had been jailed outside this country. So Al Jazeera is an organization which rubs people up the wrong way on both sides of the aisle, and they say to themselves, well, if everybody's angry at us, we must be doing something right. As I say, though, they are the tip of the iceberg. They took a lot of heat yesterday for putting out those pictures of the captured American prisoners of war. They were by no means the only television network in this region to put those pictures out, and they were by no means the most egregious in terms of repeating them again and again and again. We saw Abu Dhabi television, Lebanese broadcasting, many others, including, of course, Iraqi television, putting those pictures out on a loop. And so Al Jazeera is, to some extent, many analysts of the Arab media say, one of the more respectable television networks in this part of the world.
Simon, before I let you go, we're looking at these pictures of Tariq Aziz and one of the this is Al Jazeera. You can recognize it with the flame-like logo. Before I let you go, we just heard from Mike Tobin in Qatar about journalists who had crossed over into Iraq and are trying to get back, and some very experienced war reporters telling their colleagues back in Qatar that this is as bad as they have ever seen anything. So what about the novices? What about the people around you that you have seen that really haven't been in one of these before, and this is their baptism by fire?
John, nobody emerges from the womb able to cover a story like this. I mean, you learn how to cover a story like this by experience. But I have to tell you, one of the really sad pieces of news that I've heard in the course of the past 48 hours is the loss of a former colleague of mine. I was privileged enough back in the late 1980s to work very closely with Terry Lloyd of ITN, one of the most experienced war correspondents in this business, who died, killed in a friendly fire incident, it now appears, in and around the city of Basra. He was trying to get to Basra as what we call a unilateral. He was not embedded with one of the US or UK Army companies. He was just going there independently. You know, Terry was not a particularly chance-taking journalist. He was a very experienced war correspondent, and if a conflict like this can take the life of a Terry Lloyd, dead at the age of 50, much too early for him to leave the screen, then it can take the lives of any one of our very brave colleagues who are out there in the battlefield trying to cover this conflict.
Simon Marks in Amman, Jordan. Simon, thanks very much. Do be careful. And of course, we're thinking about our people who are out on the front lines, including Rick Leventhal and Greg Kelly. The Defense Department saying Iraq is engaged in deadly deception and violating the rules of war. Let's check in with Major Garrett live at the Pentagon. Hi, Major.
Hello, John. Let's get to that deadly deception in just a minute, because we have some breaking news here at the Pentagon on the cost of war. A very big topic on Capitol Hill and throughout the country. Well, the Pentagon just now has released its first request to Congress for specific funding for the war in Iraq. The grand total, $62.6 billion. John, let me break down how the Pentagon allocates it as follows. $13.1 billion for military operations ongoing now, $12 billion to stabilize Iraq, $7.2 billion for reconstruction after the conflict, and $30 billion for what is described as coercive diplomacy. We've checked on what that might mean. What that means is the cost of the buildup and the pre-placement of U.S. and coalition forces all around Iraq before the war actually began in earnest. Grand total again, $62.6 billion. Some voices in Congress already saying that's too low. It'll probably have to be increased in the future. That's the Pentagon request as it stands now. Moving on to this question and this issue, which is very topical here, John, I must tell you, at the Pentagon, because of the casualties inflicted on the battlefield so far, a great majority of them have been involved in skirmishes with Iraqi forces that have disguised themselves. And Victoria Clark, the spokesman for the Pentagon, addressed that issue at the briefing this afternoon, and here's what she said.
The Iraqi regime is engaged in other deadly deceptions. They are sending forces out carrying white surrender flags or dressing them as liberated civilians to draw coalition forces into ambushes. Both of these actions are among the most serious violations of the laws of war. Known as perfidy or treachery, such acts are strictly prohibited because they make it extraordinarily difficult for coalition forces to accept surrendering forces or protect civilians. Some liken these acts to terrorism.
John, I can tell you in conversations with senior defense officials, the feeling here at the Pentagon is the motivation of Iraqi forces is to get the coalition to change its tactics, to shoot civilians before asking questions. The Pentagon said today that won't happen. They're going to maintain their tactics as they are, but take great care whenever they encounter civilians across the battlefield. We have a map of southern Iraq right now. I want to transition to a topic of a chemical weapons facility discovered by coalition forces yesterday. An investigation was done. It did not appear to be an active chemical weapons facility, one that was producing anything in the here and now. There'll be a very serious investigation if there are any trace elements of chemical weapons found there. It was near the town of Najaf. Later on, a more experienced crew will come in there and do some very fine analysis of what was remaining in some of the drums there to find out exactly what was present there. At the moment now, no chemical weapons found. It doesn't appear to have been an active or recently active chemical weapons facility. And so far, coalition forces report encountering no Scuds or Scud launchers or weapons of mass destruction to date. And the last issue I want to transition to some gun camera video they showed here at the Pentagon. Two images. The first is a clip showing a military vehicle in a berm that's protected in the desert being destroyed by F-15 bombs, F-15 planes rather, dropping 500-pound bombs. The image you see on the screen now, two F-14s dropping precision-guided weapons on hangars and an airfield near Baghdad, west of Baghdad, considered the largest and most important fighter base the Iraqi Air Force possesses. It's worth pointing out, John, that in this entire conflict, the Iraqi Air Force, which wasn't much to begin with, has not scrambled a single aircraft to engage coalition planes.
John, before I let you go, if they ever aren't finding any Scuds, where are those Scuds coming that they keep shooting at William La Jeunesse?
It's an excellent question. They are not Scuds. The word we have received here at the Pentagon is that those are a different type of surface-to-surface frogs, Albabil 100s or Al-Samud 2s, not Scuds. Central Command and the Pentagon have checked this out 6 ways to Sunday and have found no Scuds. But it doesn't mean Al-Samud 2s, frogs, or Albabil 100s are not potentially lethal. They, in fact, are. What the big news is the Patriot missile defense system, particularly the 4th generation known as the PAC-3, has performed beyond all expectations here at the Pentagon, intercepting all fired, and that is a great relief to the Pentagon, which pre-placed those PAC-3 Patriot missile system batteries before they had passed all of their typical field testing. They did that on sort of a hunch because the early tests had been very successful. It hadn't completed all of them. They did it on a hunch, and it's performed, they would say here at the Pentagon, masterfully.
Major Garrett, a frog, of course, is a free rocket over ground. Just fire it and kind of figure out later where it hit. Major Garrett at the Pentagon, thanks very much. Our government and the Red Cross complaining that Iraqi treatment of our POWs violates the Geneva Convention. The very notion of rules during war can seem like an oxymoron at times. Here to explain how they work, Fox News senior judicial analyst Judge Andrew Napolitano. So, you know, all of this complaining about about taking pictures or interviewing these POWs seems to put into the background the real offense, which is executing prisoners of war.
Well, absolutely.
Which they evidently have done.
Well, apparently they have. I mean, we all saw that horrific picture of the soldier with the bullet in his head.
Well, we saw. I don't know where you saw that. What I saw was a picture of bodies lying around with no identifiable faces because there's still families out there.
Obviously, any kind of an execution is a violation of the rules of war. It's almost impossible to enforce the rules of war until you win and you capture those who have violated them. And if they're still alive, you put them on trial for war crimes.
Is there any chance you can find the, low-level goofball Iraqi who executed American prisoners of war?
Probably not. There probably is no way to find that individual, but that is the type of criminal responsibility that goes upstream. And you can hold the highest-ranking person you catch, whether it's Saddam Hussein or Tariq Aziz or the defense minister or whoever it might be, criminally liable for the criminal acts of those under his command.
Okay. Now, what is the violation of the Geneva Convention rules of war? We're looking at some video from the field in southern Iraq as these guys try to surrender, and Americans treating them with some suspicion, as you would imagine.
Right.
What is the actual rule about putting a television camera in the face of a person that's been captured and asking them a few questions?
If the capture happens to occur on film, it's
here.
Right, it's a newsworthy event. If the capture was staged, or the prisoners are paraded, or the interrogation is filmed, those are express violations of the Geneva Conventions because they violate privacy, they use the prisoners for propaganda purposes, and they're expressly prohibited. Probably, as you pointed out, the least offensive thing they do to prisoners. But again, the rule is pretty clear. If a camera is there and it's newsworthy, it gets on the air. If not, it's staged, it's illegal.
Judge Andrew Napolitano, Judge, as always, thanks a lot.
You're welcome, John.
As the march continues towards Baghdad, our ground troops are also establishing a presence in northern Iraq, coalition warplanes pounding Iraqi bunkers there. Chris Klein covering the fighting in northern Iraq. Chris.
John, in the course of the last 45 minutes or so, this particular sector of the front is quiet, at least for the time being. That hasn't been the case for most of this evening. From our vantage point, we are approximately about 1,000 yards from a 5-mile-long Iraqi front, home to anti-aircraft batteries, mortars, bunkers, and sandbagged machine gun positions. Some 20 miles to the west is the city of Mosul, which, like the city of Kirkuk, both of them valuable strategic cities in the north because of their airfields, because of their massive oil installations. We've seen throughout this evening repeated heavy Allied aerial activity, aerial bombardment. We also saw a considerable amount of returning Iraqi AAA gunfire, and equally here in the course of the last hour, for a very brief period, we saw in the distance what seemed to be a very brisk firefight. We saw tracer fire, small arms fire, but coming horizontally rather than vertically to the sky, one imagines aimed at Allied pilots. So it was clearly a ground engagement. It was only a few kilometers from here, and on a couple of occasions we saw some rather large almost phosphorescent explosions, and apropos, it would seem that white phosphorus shells were being exploded. Who took part in that engagement is difficult to say, because as far as we know for the time being, the Free Kurdish forces on our side of this demarcation line have not openly started to engage the Iraqis. We do know that a very small number of Allied special forces are now in country and are steadily being reinforced day by day, also in anticipation of the arrival of considerably larger airborne and perhaps air assault forces, but no sign of them yet. And of course, due to reasons of operational security, as we become aware of their movement, we're going to be very guarded about where they deploy. John.
All right, Chris Klein in northern Iraq, where the action is underway. Chris, please be careful. Thank you very much. That is it for the big story this hour. Fox News continuing coverage of Operation Iraqi Freedom continues now. Special report with Britt Hume. In just a moment, Britt.
Next on a special edition of Special Report, more U.S. prisoners are shown on Iraqi TV, this time said to be 2 missing helicopter pilots. U.S. commanders say, though, progress in the war has been, quote, rapid and in some cases dramatic. Secretary of State Powell tells Fox News in an exclusive interview the progress has been, quote, amazing, the casualties light, the resistance not organized. Saddam is seen on Iraqi TV again, but in a videotape edited in 67 places. The U.S. presses Russia on the military equipment it is sending into Baghdad. Stay tuned. Welcome to Washington. It's shortly after 2 a.m. in Baghdad right now, and all is quiet, but we're keeping an eye on Iraq and the surrounding region, and we'll take you there live if anything develops over the next hour. In the meantime, U.S. forces have moved within 50 miles of Baghdad. Attack helicopters are taking aim at Saddam Hussein's elite forces guarding the Iraqi capital. But so far, those Iraqi forces have shown no sign of surrender. And for the latest on all of that news, Pentagon correspondent Brett Baer joins us live. Brett?
Brett, Pentagon officials say special operations troops are now operating unopposed throughout the country of Iraq. They can say that there will be ups and downs in this campaign. Continue to see intense resistance in some parts, and some reports on the ground is that the firing is coming from all sides, from houses, from rooftops, from places where Iraqi Republican guards are not located. We can tell you that troops are moving into the north significantly, and according to senior defense officials, it could be an interesting next 24 hours.
We've joined up with some heavy artillery out here, and there has been a barrage of artillery and what sounds like machine gun fire.
Iraqi troops closer to Baghdad are not giving up, and defense officials expect significant battles soon.
I actually have seen no surprise here, and I think that that our people on the ground have not seen a surprise.
So far, U.S. commanders say the Iraqi fighting has not been organized, but also has not been light.
They are not nearly as well trained as ours, but again, I would say they are somewhat tenacious.
We lit them up. They hit the deck, but they continued to advance. They were within probably 50, 60 meters.
We have come across dead enders, and we've had some terrific firefights with some of these. Not unexpected. I think our people are prepared to fight this war.
The first significant coalition attack on an Iraqi Republican Guard division happened today in Karbala, 50 miles south of Baghdad. The Iraqis' Medina division was attacked by almost 40 Apache attack helicopters. The Apaches came under heavy fire. One Apache longbow had a hard landing and ended up on Iraqi television intact. The 2 pilots' helmets were found on the ground nearby. 2 separate search and rescue efforts were launched immediately, but turned away after also encountering heavy fire. Central Command would only say the 2 pilots were still missing, but 2 pilots were shown on Arabic television networks late in the day. And after looking at the images, Pentagon officials confirmed they appeared authentic. Some question why the Apaches were used instead of constant bombardment from bombers. The answer? To find out exactly where the hidden Medina units are.
To a spread out military unit like the Medina Division, unlike a static headquarters or something easier to find, sometimes if they've done well camouflaging and putting them in berms, you have to go out and you have to look. The Apache, when operating in organizations, has the ability to go out with scout helicopters as well.
The bombardment of Republican Guard units is heavy and continuous. Here, an F-15 takes out an Iraqi missile launcher southeast of Baghdad, and this gun camera video shows 2 F-14s striking an Iraqi fighter base west of Baghdad. To date, the Iraqis have not managed to send up a single aircraft. Today, for the first time, Pentagon officials acknowledged accidentally hitting civilians inside Iraq. A television-guided missile hit a bridge and a bus in western Iraq, killing 5.
Unintended casualties like this are regrettable. We extend our sympathies to the families of those civilians who were accidentally killed.
Meantime, Central Command released images of targets hit in and around Baghdad. A palace guard facility with a barracks and office complex was struck with multiple precision-guided weapons. A pre-strike image shows the facility intact. Post-strike shows what's left.
Each one of those blue arrows represents a different weapon that was delivered against the target set. And different from the old days, we don't bring multiple aircraft in. We may send a specific missile or a specific guided weapon system against each one of those points to achieve the desired effect.
In fact, International Red Cross members are now inside Baghdad. They report after 2 days of heavy bombardment, one major hospital in Baghdad had just 1 fatality. They were treating 32 injuries. Another hospital in Baghdad was treating 2 newly wounded civilians, a sign that the precision strikes, according to the Pentagon, are working. Brett?
Brett, guerrilla warfare seems to be the weapon of choice against our troops in some areas over there. How worried is the Pentagon about the effect of that?
Well, they expected it, actually. According to General Tommy Franks, he said his troops are ready to deal with these small numbers of resistance as they come up onto the U.S. and coalition forces moving toward Baghdad, and they'll deal with them as they encounter them.
All right, Brett Baer, thanks very much. Saddam Hussein insisted victory is very near on Iraqi state-run television today and praised Iraqi commanders even as U.S. forces closed in on Baghdad. But he was vague in describing the U.S.-led military campaign and said nothing that would establish the precise time the videotape was made. Fox News senior White House correspondent Jim Angle reports.
Saddam Hussein appeared on Iraqi television today, encouraging Iraqis to fight and, as always, predicting victory.
I tell them, patience, patience, my brother. Victory is coming soon.
But coalition officials said yet another videotaped address offers no convincing evidence of whether Hussein is dead, alive, or wounded.
I mean, the truthful position is that we cannot be sure. We cannot be sure whether these recordings are pre-recorded. Some of them appear to be dated, but I don't think there is an exact science in this.
No one has any indication on whether it is canned or whether it is fresh. And that's the nature of the tape. That's the nature of the comments that he's made.
In fact, senior officials tell Fox the intelligence community has little doubt the man on the tape is in fact Saddam Hussein, but do have some doubts about when the tape was made. For one thing, officials noted, he praises a number of military units, including some, said one official, that are not praiseworthy.
I am so proud, and your leadership is proud, and you has no limits. We are very proud of you, you glorious fighters.
Hussein named one unit, the 51st Division, whose soldiers were among those who surrendered at first contact. And other units, cited officials say, have seen little action. In fact, a close examination of the tape shows some 67 edits in about 25 minutes, something rarely, if ever, seen in Saddam Hussein's speeches. Some analysts believe that editing is to excise previously recorded statements that would be, as one official put it, even more off the mark. Nevertheless, a top Iraqi official insists that Saddam Hussein is alive and well.
Saddam Hussein has full control over his country and his armed forces and the Iraqi people.
American analysts say there just isn't enough evidence one way or the other to make a definitive judgment about Hussein's status. But whatever it is, and despite some occasional bad news, British Prime Minister Tony Blair told Parliament that nothing will change the outcome of the war.
That we will encounter more difficulties and anxious moments in the days ahead is certain. But no less certain, indeed more so, is coalition victory.
In spite of a tough fight in Parliament over Iraq and a weekend that brought some new British casualties, support for the war there is rapidly growing. One poll shows support leaping from 38% about a week ago to 54% now. In mid-February, approval stood at only 29%. Blair will visit President Bush later this week. Meanwhile, after meeting with his economic advisors, the president was ready to unveil his emergency spending request to cover the cost of the war. He invited members of Congress to the White House late today to ask for quick passage of about $75 billion in additional monies, $62 billion of it for the Pentagon.
The funding the president will seek will cover not only the operational and ongoing costs incurred to fight the war, but will also include funding for vital homeland security programs at home.
Now, the $75 billion or so, Brit, will include about $4 billion for homeland security and another $8 billion that will be divided up among aid for Israel, Turkey, and Jordan, additional monies for the war on terrorism, and a down payment on humanitarian aid inside Iraq. And that number for the Pentagon is based on an estimate that the war will last about 30 days. Britt.
And to securing the peace that will follow this war. I ask Congress to act quickly and responsibly.
This shows you just how quickly the cost of a war can add up. Wednesday's so-called decapitation strike, which started the war in Baghdad, used 39 cruise missiles at roughly $600,000 apiece, roughly. That airstrike alone cost more than $23 million. Meanwhile, there are questions from Congress on whether the United States can afford both the war and the president's tax cut. The Senate, with a Republican majority, voted 51 to 48 to slash the tax cut basically in half. War is dominating the airwaves, of course. Coming up, we'll ask whether all the media coverage is having an impact on public opinion. Well, part of that coverage, prisoners of war, of course, and we'll hear from some of their families as well. Our coverage of war in Iraq continues with some of the pictures.
But the teams securing the bridge have no doubt that irregular fighters are trying to slip in and out of Basra. Suspects are rounded up and escorted back to their base for interrogation. The overall commander of the Desert Rats accused the paramilitaries of appalling brutality.
We've been hearing stories of this kind of brutality, but this is the first occasion on which we've actually witnessed it.
So why wasn't he intervening to end the suffering?
Well, I'm weighing up the risk to my own forces. I'm weighing up the risk to the civilians who are being held hostage, effectively, in Basra.
For those risking this dangerous journey, the delay could be deadly. A bleak choice between running out of food or braving the crossfire. Juliet Bremner, near Basra.
British Pool report out of Basra today. One of the dominant storylines of the day has been the image of civilian casualties. They were broadcast around the world, including here in the United States. Especially gruesome pictures were seen across Arab media. They came out of a marketplace in a Baghdad neighborhood. The Iraqi position is, according to the information minister, that dozens of people died in a coalition airstrike on that neighborhood. The Central Command, the coalition side, says
says they believe for now the damage may have been caused by an Iraqi aircraft fire that had somehow gone astray. This is what happens in war, the two sides trying to argue their case in the international media. CNN's Nick Robertson has been following this part of the story as it unfolds tonight. He's at the Iraqi-Jordanian border again. And Nick, as always, good evening to you.
Good evening, Aaron, and very, very difficult even for the journalists inside Baghdad to try and verify those figures and accounts of what happened in the early evening hours last night, Baghdad time. And for us here, the CNN team stuck outside of Iraq, doubly difficult. But talking to reporters inside Baghdad, they told me they were called by Iraq's Ministry of Information shortly after dusk and told to go to this residential neighborhood just west of the center of the city to investigate what the Iraqi officials told them was a coalition bomb. And certainly the images from this evening will further polarize positions on this war. A brilliant flash illuminates the area around the information ministry in Baghdad as what appears to be government buildings in the center of the city are targeted. Only a few hours earlier, crowds gathered around a crater in a suburban neighborhood. Impossible to see how deep it is or what caused it. According to Iraqi officials who rushed journalists to the site just after dusk, the damage caused by a coalition bomb. In a nearby hospital, the injured were still being brought in, many clearly in pain.
Around 6 p.m., an enemy aircraft attacked the neighborhood where we were in the hospital, assisting the wounded from this morning attack. The scoured aircraft attacked a popular market filled with residents.
According to the hospital staff, at least 51 people were killed and more than 50 injured. From these pictures alone, it is impossible to verify the number of casualties. Several children, however, seem to be victims. Within hours of the blast, Iraq's information minister lambasted coalition forces.
My explanation is that this is a heavy aggression on civilians to cover up for a series of defeat that our army caused them in the desert and different neighborhoods in Baghdad.
Coalition forces said they could not confirm an attack in this neighborhood. In a war whose images seem increasingly split between civilian casualties and frontline conflict, this latest incident looks set to widen the divide. Indeed, as you say, Aaron, the Arab media, particularly in this region around Iraq, are playing much stronger images than the images we have used. I saw on one station pictures in the mortuary, apparently at the same hospital, of some children, perhaps 5 or 6 years old. The images being seen in this region, very, very emotive indeed. Aaron?
It seems to me that we ought to try and make a couple of points here. Number one, while certainly the Iraqis are using this moment to their best advantage, we ought never forget that these are real people who were, however it happened, clearly wounded. Some died, and that's a horrible thing. The second is that the British side, the American side, also used the Basra situation to try and make their international argument that the Iraqi government is barbaric by using the shooting of the civilians. And what you end up having in the region is a war of words. Who wins the war of images? Do the Americans ever win that battle?
Certainly the Iraqi authorities know that this is perhaps one of the strongest elements they have in their arsenal against the United States, against Great Britain, because it is so emotive. The injuries to civilians who, as you rightly say, are very real people. I think perhaps everyone knows that war is a very dirty and ugly business, but perhaps this war, because the level of coverage that it has had from both sides, is perhaps exposing to an audience that has never really seen it before just how bad and ugly it is, and it happens in a very short time frame. And both sides, because of the necessities of war, both sides in this need to win the war. Both sides have a necessity to present in the best light their particular case. And certainly for the Iraqis, it is highlighting civilian casualties. For coalition forces, it is to show that they are being compassionate towards Iraqi civilians, which is absolutely their intended, stated purpose here. That is to remove the regime, but not in any way to harm the population, Aaron.
And just one more point. It seems like now 3 days in a row, they have tried to take out the Iraqis' ability to communicate. There was the hit on state-run TV, and there seemed to be, over the last 2 nights, attacks around the information ministry. So far, unsuccessful, correct?
So far, Iraq's state-run television is still on the air. However, the channel that is run by President Saddam Hussein's elder son, Uday Saddam Hussein, we understand that is off the air. Iraq's third station, if you will, its satellite broadcast network, that appears to be off the air. The communications tower that was in the center of Baghdad, a communications building that was hit on the previous night, that apparently has affected some telephone services within the city. So there does appear to be some degradation of Iraqi officialdom's ability to reach and communicate with their population. It is not entirely severed, and at this stage we still don't know what's happened fully to Iraq's information ministry. But it appears that much of the superstructure of the building is still in place, because that's where those cameras stand that took the pictures we saw this evening.
Right. Nick, thank you. As always, Nick Robertson, who's still on the border of Iraq and Jordan, having been expelled by the Iraqi government now several days ago, and we'll talk to you later. I want to bring General Clark in a moment to talk about this, but let me put one more piece on the table here, and that's this one. The residents in Kuwait got a reminder tonight as well that they are not yet safe from the Iraqi military machine, if you will. There was a huge explosion at a shopping mall there, the result of what Kuwaiti authorities now believe was a missile attack. There's considerable evidence of that, including physical evidence in the hands of CNN's Sanjay Gupta, who was on the scene shortly after the explosion and joins us now from a safer place, if you will, our workspace there. The last time you and I talked, you literally had in your hand a piece of what almost certainly was the missile.
That's right, and I brought those pieces over as well, and I'll hold them up again while I'm talking about them. First of all, let me just say that we were told that these pieces were safe to pick up. Before we picked them up, they were actually checked out. A greenish piece here in my left hand, and a component, as you can see, both pieces there, probably pieces of the missile. One of them may be more of a sort of working component part of the missile, and this greenish sort of part is sort of a little interesting for me personally, Aaron, because I saw something fly over my head a week ago when I was at Camp Iwo Jima that looked like a green missile, got in underneath the radar. There were no alarms or anything before that thing went right over our heads. This was sort of frighteningly reminiscent of that. There were no sirens or anything this time either. The first indication we got of anything going on shortly before 2 o'clock in the morning was a loud boom, literally shaking our hotel, which is a good 10 minutes away from the Sukshuk Mall, which we've been hearing so much about. Aaron?
The earlier tonight, one of the pieces that you held up had some Chinese characters on it, which suggests very strongly the kind of, there we go, the kind of missile it was. And I know you're becoming very expert very quickly on these missiles, and perhaps the reason they avoided detection is that they come in so low.
And that's exactly what we talked to some of the Kuwaiti officials about that very point. And in fact, they took that piece that people just saw with the Chinese writing on it for investigative purposes. We were glad to let them have it. But that's exactly what they said as well. These things may be quite literally flying in under the radar, as the one did a week ago, and maybe this one as well. Again, the first indication of the actual explosion itself.
A couple more who, what, wheres here. No serious injuries, correct?
No serious injuries. One minor injury, probably from debris falling on somebody's head.
And I suspect that we said, in fact, at the top of the program, the biggest casualty may be the Kuwaiti state of mind. After a week and a half of this, they had come to believe perhaps that the Patriots would protect them from anything like this, and that turns out not to be so.
Yeah, you know, it's really interesting. A couple of things struck me. First of all, I guess in any sort of situation like this, it was kind of, there was pandemonium there. A lot of people really struggling to try and get close to it, and then the authorities quickly coming in and creating barriers around the explosion site.
But they moved with a lot of efficiency, the authorities that is, almost as if A, they had been through this before, which they had, and B, almost as if they were expecting something like this. First the civilian authorities, followed by the military authorities. There were chemical and biological checks going on all the time. There was a lot of concern initially, but as people started to get the sense, A, that no one was hurt, and B, that there was no chemical or biological weapons being detected by these sensors, you could almost see this sense of relief coming over people despite this just horrible thing that had just happened. Again, no one being hurt, this happening at 2 o'clock in the morning, no one being in the mall, were all sort of the good things out of this very bad thing. Aaron?
Sanjay, thank you. Dr. Sanjay Gupta in Kuwait. And now we've put a number of pieces on the table. Let's turn to General Wes Clark, who's back with us in Atlanta. Back to front here. The significance that a week and a half into this, the Iraqis still have the capability to hit Kuwait City.
Well, we haven't put enough forces to clear the zone in all of southern Iraq. We're still working around Basra. This missile was a silkworm. It was somewhere around Qasr, Basra, somewhere like that, from which it was launched. Not surprising. Until we fully clear that zone, there's the chance they could hit us again.
Let's say there's also, would it not then stand to reason there's a chance they could just change direction and aim it at a concentration of coalition forces?
They could. There's no doubt they could do that.
So it's not simply a question they can hit Kuwait, it's that they still have the capability, a military capability in an area that at this point there was a presumption would be cleared.
It's true, but this silkworm strike on Kuwait City is essentially a terror weapon. This weapon launched inland is, we don't believe, accurate enough to hit any precision target if they had targeting capability. They fired this to send a message to the Kuwaitis.
They throw it up in the air and it comes down.
Exactly.
Well, we'll see what sort of message they sent. Now, on the subject we're talking with Nick about, this question of the image war, the political media war that's going on, each side laid out, in a sense, its best argument today. The American argument, the British argument that the Iraqis will murder their own people, they'll use them as human shields, crossing the bridge in Basra, shooting them down. The Iraqis talking about civilian casualties in the market. Do the Americans in the international, you've been through this, in the international community ever get the benefit of the doubt?
Well, we did in the Kosovo campaign, Aaron. You may remember in that campaign that there were the scenes of the collateral damage and people were injured and occasionally in these bomb attacks. But the scene of Milosevic forcefully expelling tens of thousands of Albanians from their own country turned world opinion so decisively against him that he couldn't recover. There's a fundamental asymmetry here between what's happening to the Iraqis as a result of the American bombing and what's happening to the Iraqi population as a result of the Fedayeen. The American bombing, this may have been an American bomb. We don't know right now. It hasn't been confirmed. If so, it was totally unintentional. We've done our best, the United States has done its best, I should say, to avoid striking civilian targets and hurting civilians. That's not the case with the Fedayeen, who must intentionally go after their own people because they have to. Their defense is the civilian population.
There are, in fact, a lot of people in lots of parts of the world, the Arab part of the world certainly, but in a lot of parts of the world that actually don't believe that. They will believe that Americans targeted civilians.
I'm not sure about that.
I get mail from them.
Well,
I'll show it to you.
When we work our way through, starting with the countries that have doubts about us in Europe, and we work from Europe outwards, you're going to find that they know from experience that the American bombing in Serbia was extraordinarily precise. It was extraordinarily limited, just as it has been in Baghdad to strike military targets. And occasionally something goes wrong. And it's a terrible human tragedy for the families of the innocent people and for those victims. But it's not intentional. Whereas what the Iraqis must do is use the civilian population. Right. And what's more likely to happen is that people in the Arab world and elsewhere are going to say, well, the Iraqis have no choice, they're up against a superpower and they'll do anything and it's okay for them to do anything. Fine. But that's a different argument. And that's an argument that does violate the laws of war, which says that non-combatants must be protected.
Not to mention any sense of human decency, I would say.
Exactly.
Welcome back to Atlanta. It's really good to have you back. We'll go to the Pentagon, check in with Jamie McIntyre. We need to take a break first. CNN's coverage of the war in Iraq after a short break continues.
Did you know that tomatoes contain...
How the war is perceived to be going, with Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld criticizing what he called massive volumes of television and breathless reporting.
We have seen mood swings in the media from highs to lows to highs and back again, sometimes in a single 24-hour period.
Rumsfeld said he had only seen the headlines on Washington Post and New York Times articles reporting that the commander of U.S. ground forces, Lieutenant General William Wallace, answered it's beginning to look that way when asked if the war would be longer than expected. The enemy we're fighting is different from the one we war-gamed against, he also conceded.
F-16 delivering precision-guided munition.
The Pentagon countered with a montage of cockpit videos of successful airstrikes and maps showing that U.S. and British forces control as much as 40% of Iraqi territory and 95% of the skies.
The plan is sound, it's being executed, and it's on track, and that's essentially what General Wallace said too. He said we're about where we expected to be. That's one of his quotes as well.
After delays caused by mines in the harbor, humanitarian aid on a British ship has finally reached the port of Qasr. And the Pentagon insists delays in getting food, fuel, and ammunition to U.S. troops on the front lines in Iraq were mostly due to sandstorms, and dismissed any attacks on the 300-mile-long supply lines as, quote, militarily insignificant. But even as the U.S. encircles Baghdad and moves Apache helicopters in position to pound Republican Guard troops, the Pentagon admits there's a key unknown: the extent to which the Iraqi people may feel a patriotic fervor to resist U.S. forces sent to liberate them. Despite being a linchpin of U.S. policy, Rumsfeld insists the Iraqi mood is unknowable.
They might even feel a little different if the death squads are not standing next to them with guns to their heads. But why should I try to speculate as to what it will be, since we will soon know?
Death squads is what the Pentagon is calling the Fedayeen Saddam now, and the U.S. is continuing to try to target them. We're getting word tonight from the U.S. Central Command that U.S. F-15 jets attacked a two-story building in Basra, just about 300 yards away from the Al-Basra Christian Church. According to U.S. intelligence, about 200 of these Fedayeen fighters were meeting in a building there. They used a special bomb that has a delayed fuse so that it would penetrate the building, explode inside, and minimize the collateral damage. They say they don't believe they damaged the church that short distance away. Aaron?
Do they have the bomb damage assessment on this yet?
Well, they just dropped the bombs a short time ago, and of course it always takes a little time to figure out if the pilots come back. They always have very optimistic reports about hitting their targets, but they have to check the videos and see what they actually show.
So we'll see what tomorrow brings on that. Jamie, thank you. Jamie McIntyre. Well, another long day at the Pentagon. The president is at Camp David. Before he left, he once again tried to underscore the administration's view of things. Dana Bash has the White House Watch tonight. Dana, good evening to you.
Good evening, Aaron. And as you said, the president is at Camp David, but before he left, he made clear that there could be more casualties ahead in the days to come in this war. And just as they did at the Pentagon, at the White House, they try to retaliate against suggestions that the war isn't going as planned.
Against this enemy, we will accept no outcome except complete victory.
Capping a week of public appearances to rally support and manage expectations, the president used the megaphone of his post to send the message the war is on track.
The regime that once terrorized all of Iraq now controls a small portion of that country. Coalition troops continue their steady advance and are drawing near to Baghdad. We're inflicting severe damage on enemy forces.
Mr. Bush, speaking before war veterans at the White House, spoke of the brutality of the Iraqi regime towards prisoners of war and its own people, and promised Americans will soon liberate.
And we refuse to leave the Iraqi people in slavery under Saddam Hussein. When the war in Iraq is won, all who have joined this cause will be able to say to the Iraqi people, we were proud to fight for your freedom.
Day 9 of the conflict, a senior presidential aide says the commander-in-chief is irritated by, quote, silly reporter questions of a flawed battle plan, talk of a longer war ahead than anticipated, and constant television analysis.
We haven't been welcomed as liberators yet. We haven't quite gotten rid of Saddam Hussein yet.
The White House says Mr. Bush never put a timetable on this war and did prepare the nation in speeches like this one in October.
Military conflict could be difficult. An Iraqi regime faced with its own demise may attempt cruel and desperate measures.
But just before the war began, Vice President Cheney said it would be, quote, relatively quick, weeks rather than months. The White House today said that those comments should be put into context, that he also said that things could get complicated. And today, Aaron, a senior official admitted that they were reluctant to prepare the nation in detail for what this war would perhaps have ahead, especially when they were still dealing with the diplomatic events. They were very reluctant to talk about the war. Aaron.
Dana, thank you. Dana Bash at the White House. We'll take a break here. We'll give you an update on the headlines. And then we'll also be joined tonight by Jeff Greenfield. We have much to do. We're glad you're with us. Our coverage continues in a moment.
Air defenses tonight, apparently firing a missile that hit the country's most popular shopping mall. It was empty at the time. 2 people were only slightly injured, though. The impact did shatter several windows. Experts suspect Iraq fired what's known as a Chinese silkworm missile, which flies too low to be shot down. More huge explosions rocked Baghdad, and it appears the target was Iraq's information ministry. Iraqi officials also claim Allied forces struck a residential neighborhood and killed more than 50 civilians. The U.S. military says it targets only military sites and has accused Iraq of placing those sites in residential areas. 5 U.S. servicemen wounded on the battlefield in Iraq are back on home soil. They arrived at the Walter Reed Army Medical Center in Washington, D.C. today with a variety of war wounds. In other news now, Greek officials say the hijacker of a Turkish Airlines Airbus has surrendered and is in custody. The plane, carrying 196 passengers and 8 crew members, was hijacked shortly after takeoff from Istanbul. Greek officials have identified the hijacker as a male student thought to be a Turkish national. And here's a welcome distraction during a time of war, the national pastime. The Cincinnati Reds tonight opened the brand new Great American Ballpark with an exhibition game against the Cleveland Indians. Baseball's regular season opening day is Sunday. And Aaron, I have to tell you, they're saying that the ballpark is nice, but the home team needs work. They lost 6-1.
Doesn't count till it counts, though.
That's right.
Still spring training.
That's true.
Thank you.
As well as mammoth hits on the outskirts of the city. That's where those Republican Guard units are said to be dug in. Meanwhile, a funeral today in Baghdad said to include some of those killed in a marketplace explosion yesterday. The Iraqis claim it was a U.S. missile that was responsible for that explosion. Interestingly, though, British sources are saying today that the commander of the air defense forces for Iraq was replaced. Why? The Iraqi surface-to-air missiles failing to hit their targets and maybe falling back into the city of Baghdad. The U.S. Central Command says the explosion yesterday and another incident 2 days ago could have been the result of stray Iraqi missiles. And some chilling words from the Iraqi Vice President Taha Yassin Ramadan today, this coming in the wake of the deaths of those 4 U.S. soldiers killed by a car bomber in southern Iraq. Ramadan said, "We will use any means to kill our enemy in our own land. This is just the beginning." In fact, the name of the person responsible for that car bombing was cited. He was given posthumous awards by Iraqi President Saddam Hussein. And as for Saddam Hussein, once again, another sighting. He appeared with some of his top aides, military and government officials, on Iraqi state television. Don't know when that tape was made. Shep.
Greg Balcott live this Sunday.
and working inside the borders of the enemy. Most of the troops concentrated in southern Iraq and pushing northward toward Baghdad for the showdown over the capital. In just one day, U.S. and coalition aircraft flew more than 1,000 missions over Iraq, and that number doesn't include new bombings in Baghdad. Today, U.S. warplanes dropping more than a dozen 500-pound bombs in attacks on Baghdad, with more bombing after nightfall. U.S. forces have launched 6,000 precision-guided bombs at Iraqi targets in the war so far, as well as 675 Tomahawk cruise missiles. The air campaign to weaken the defense lines of Iraqi troops around Baghdad before the push into the city. Only 7 Tomahawks have missed their targets because of mechanical problems since the start of the war. And despite France's efforts to stop the coalition movement against Iraq, 49 countries now supporting Operation Iraqi Freedom. Shep?
Rebecca Gomez live in New York. The Screaming Eagles of the 101st Airborne Division pressing onward toward Baghdad with Geraldo in tow. The elite group providing crucial support to hundreds of soldiers deep inside Iraq. In some cases, they're securing small towns after coalition forces pass through. Their Apache helicopters also playing a role in airstrikes near the city of Karbala. Thousands of coalition soldiers have been moving across the desert for more than a week now, each day setting up a new camp in a new location. And with each hour that passes, they use up more food and supplies. It's an internal battle to stay strong and healthy. And a Fox report now from Rick Leventhal with the 1st Marine Light Armored Reconnaissance Battalion. Rick?
Baghdad. Certainly the residents of that city are not witnessing it. Fires lit up the night sky in the Iraqi capital tonight. Arabic television reporting that the blaze was engulfing in part a residential area of the city, but there's been no indication yet of any casualties. Iraqi television claimed tonight that 357 civilians have died in the first 10 days of the war and 3,600 have been injured, but it's impossible to verify those claims. The Red Cross is now operational in Baghdad, and one of the things the Red Cross is doing is pressuring the Iraqi authorities to give them access to some of those captured American POWs. Up in the north, carpet bombing reported in areas close to the city of Mosul tonight. At least 20 bombs dropped close to the northern front line with Kurdish-controlled territory. Reporters say that at least one B-52 was involved. We've seen within the last hour other B-52s getting ready to take off. The target up in the north was a town controlled by forces loyal to President Saddam Hussein. Down in the south, the British Army distributing humanitarian aid today. You saw just before the hour some of those dolphins that were involved in clearing the mines from the port at Qasr so that humanitarian aid could be distributed. Now the mines are gone, aid is arriving, and the British Army is posting job ads in the city. They're looking for local staff to work in the port.
And we've informed them that we would like to have approximately 85 people and for employment. We've told them what type of employment that we're recruiting for, and they've supplied the individuals from different families so that we can spread the wages throughout the community.
Well, also from Qasr tonight, some frightening news. 2 Iraqi soldiers who surrendered earlier in the day are now telling US-led forces that they were sent there specifically to launch terrorist strikes against US-led forces.
For our coalition forces to move in. And this is exactly what the Pentagon is referring to when it says the fiercest fighting awaits. But of course, military officials have no doubts about the final outcome. Now, there are nearly 300,000 coalition forces deployed in Operation Iraqi Freedom, with reinforcements on the way. Some divisions as close as 50 miles from Baghdad. That, of course, is as specific as we are going to get for the protection. But the push moves on, and that's the latest developments in our troop movements. I'm Rebecca Gomez in Fox Central. Derek, Bob.
Thanks for that, Rebecca.
A peacekeeper's compound in Afghanistan, the victim of a violent attack. We joined Khurshid Nosrati on the phone. She is in Kabul with the latest. Khurshid.
Hi. Just a few hours ago, a rocket was fired into Kabul, slamming into the headquarters of ISAF, the International Security Assistance Force that helps maintain peace and security in the Afghan capital. The ISAF headquarters are located directly across the street from the U.S. Embassy here in Kabul. At this time, there are no casualties or injuries reported, but there is a confirmation that a second rocket hit another area on the outskirts of Kabul just an hour or so afterwards. And the Afghan government has confirmed that in the last 48 hours there have been reports of an infiltration of Taliban and other terrorist elements from across the border in Pakistan into Afghanistan, with the aim of destabilizing the Afghan government and disrupting peace and stability for both Afghans and the international community. 25 people have been taken into custody, including a few former senior Taliban leaders.
Want me to shut it off?
All right, Khurshid, thank you very much. Khurshid Nosrati reporting there, Fox News correspondent. Right now, let's get an overview of the multiple fronts in this war. From Fox military analyst, retired Army Major General Paul Vallely. General, good to see you. You've been with us through all of this, shedding your insights. What's your assessment right now?
Well, Bob, let's go to the screenwriter and let's look at some of the developments in the area of operations. If we look here at an 80-mile radius and a 60-mile radius outside of Baghdad, these are the cities and the areas where the operational tempo is increasing to a great degree right now as we speak, both from the air and the ground. As reported, we have continued attacks coming in on Baghdad. We have B-52 strikes up in this area as well down here. And the attempt is, of course, to soften up all of these targets around Baghdad so that the ground forces then will be able to conduct this next phase, which is what I am calling, and it has been called, the Battle of Baghdad. Now, when we look at the situation here from the various directions as we put the squeeze on Baghdad, we have the Marines coming up from this direction, the 3rd Infantry Division coming north. We have the 101st coming from the southwest and perhaps also from the west. And then up here, we have the 173rd working with the Kurds and the Special Operations Forces. All of this is to put maximum pressure around Baghdad here in order to take out the necessary remaining units there, as well as indicating probably an offer that this is going to be the last time that they're going to have an opportunity to surrender here within the next 48 hours. So we're going to see how that further develops, Bob.
Well, General, I assume that those forces will cover all the open areas, but it does seem like there's a gap there in the eastern side of Baghdad. Will they close that up, or is that left as an escape route?
Well, Bob, you have the Marines coming up that direction from the southeast. Now, there is a road that comes out of Baghdad going to Iran. I would assume that the Marines will move up into that area, at least probably a couple of company-sized units or a battalion to block that off. Yeah. Now, keep in mind also you have the 82nd Airborne Brigade that has moved up into that area as well, and those 3 battalions in some part could be used to screen off or cordon off that eastern area.
Okay, let's talk about coming down from the north. Number one, do you think the numbers of troops is going to be satisfactory, because that originally was where the 4th Infantry was going to come from? And are they going to use the Kurds in this action as well?
Well, great question, Bob. They're already working with the Kurds. They're going to flow in there, as I understand, a full brigade of the 173rd. They have over 1,000 in there as of the last report. They're going to flow more equipment in, more supplies, more ammunition. Now, with the special ops already have been in that area several months now working with the Kurds, I think what they'll do is move down, because Saddam Hussein has moved the majority of his conventional units out of Mosul and Kirkuk and moved them down into Tikrit, which was in that 60-mile radius zone that I showed you previously.
Saddam's
home. So the strength is more to the south.
Saddam's home, by the way.
Saddam's home, that's correct, yes. So I would think they will be able to really move south quite rapidly there, because I don't think the defenses up there are too strong now.
Do you think that the Battle of Baghdad, and of course, we're always hesitant. We don't want to give away anything for whoever might be watching, but is this going to take place before the 4th Infantry is on hand in Iraq?
Yes, I would assume it would, Bob. They're already flowing in the 4th Infantry. The equipment is being offloaded, as I understand it. They're flowing in the forces from the United States from Fort Hood. Now, there's going to be plenty of jobs, plenty of opportunities to use that 4th Division to a great degree, but I do not think they will wait until they're all in country before we go and determine the outcome of Baghdad.
Okay, General.
So I would assume that we're going to move very quickly on that.
Let me play devil's advocate here.
Sure.
You've got a lot of territory under coalition control, but it's mostly desert. Anywhere that you have significant populations, you have some problems. You don't have the people rising up and overthrowing those that are in charge from the Ba'ath Party or whoever is forcing them into submission. And that's the case in Basra, Nasiriyah to some extent. Do those need to be taken care of? And is there a model that's going to work there?
Well, they're going to be taken care of. The British are taking care of it in the Basra, Kumasr area right now. And of course, we have the 82nd that it's moved in north of Nasiriyah. Many of these towns, of course, Bob, have already been bypassed. We're not going into all of them. Just some of the key ones, we're laying siege to it, so to speak, to provide some opportunity to break up the Ba'ath Party in those areas, the control, and then to flow in humanitarian aid as we can.
No, okay, so, now, since we're short on time, I just want to get to Baghdad quickly. You got it surrounded. You don't want to go block by block. Is this the scenario where you send in special ops, send in certain forces to take out certain members of the Ba'ath Party, certain members of the military? How does that work?
Well, that's all part of the operational plan. You have to look at all those targets, all those considerations, and then determine what forces you're going to use to attack those targets. I would assume that they're going to look at how effective the Special Republican Guard is around that southwest and southern perimeter of Baghdad. And then we may just take the 3rd ID and do a penetration right through that area and then establish some kind of a corner or a piece of territory there right inside Baghdad that can be secured, and then maybe move out from there, depending on whether that Ba'ath Party and whether Saddam and his regime give up at some point in time. So maximum pressure will be on them to give up, and then we'll move in, I guess, as best we can and reduce the forces there wherever we can.
All right, General, thank you very much. Okay, General Bob. Paul Vallely.
New questions raised about the whereabouts and well-being of Saddam Hussein. Well, let's get the story now from Julie Kurtz, reporting live from our Washington newsroom. Julie.
Hi there. Well, Pentagon officials are constantly studying the videotapes we keep seeing of Saddam Hussein for clues about his fate. The Secretary of Defense confirms today he is interested in a new piece of tape, this one without Saddam in it. It's of Thursday's press briefing. We've been showing it with the Iraqi defense minister and information minister. It's interesting because the man you see against the wall there has never been seen outside the presence of Saddam Hussein. According to intelligence sources, he is Saddam Hussein's personal bodyguard who never guards anyone else. Now, intelligence analysts were surprised when they first saw the tape this week. Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld said on Fox News Sunday that it may indicate that Saddam is not moving around much anymore, but he's either injured or even dead.
We do have reason to believe that the attack a day or two before the air war began on a regime leadership compound had senior leaders there. We know that, and we know we hit it. But we do not know, because we're not on the ground precisely, who was there and what the effect had been. All we know is that since then we have not seen Saddam Hussein or his sons live anywhere or heard any reports live.
Now, Rumsfeld also said he does not think the videos of Saddam Hussein after the bombings of his compound look legitimate to him. He says the Iraqi government's taped a lot of videos before the war, and there is nothing in them that would show they are current. Today, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff also raised questions about Saddam's fate.
Unknown, but it's curious that with enemy troops 50 miles south of the capital city, with air supremacy over most of the country, with coalition forces using several airfields in the country, that the leader has not come out and been seen on live television, that it's all been taped.
Now, the question of whether Saddam is dead or alive also gave Iraq's ambassador to the UN pause today. He tried to laugh off the question about when he was pressed about whether he thinks Saddam is dead or alive. He could only point to those edited TV clips we've all been seeing as evidence of his leader's condition. Back to you, Derek.
All right, Julie, thank you for that.
A coalition aircraft softening up Iraqi defenses around Baghdad, getting Saddam's capital ready for the big push. Let's go to Kevin Monahan. He's reporting live by video phone from the carrier Constellation. Kevin.
The Constellations are busy again this evening. Flights F-14s and F-18s heading into Baghdad. Over the last 24 hours, they have been hitting communication centers inside Baghdad itself and surface-to-air missile sites. Now, flight operations have been very, very busy here, but as the ebb and flow of the air campaign carries on over the last week or so, the flights here really have stayed have remained pretty constant, or consistent, I should say. The commanders here say that's pretty much the way they want it. They want to keep constant pressure on these guys. They want to also focus on not only air defenses, but close air support for the troops. Now, what they've been doing is in and around Baghdad, south of Baghdad, in southeast Al-Quds, they've been hitting defenses, air defenses down there, trying to give the troops as much help as they can with the Special Republican Guard. They've also been very busy in Karbala. They've been hitting ammunition bunkers as well. Now, one very interesting aspect of the air war that seems to be changing here is the problem of fueling. They've been depending on quite a few of tankers, aircraft up in the air, both Air Force and Navy tankers for their fuel. And if you were going on a typical run into Baghdad, on a fixed target, let's say a communication center in Baghdad, they would know ahead of time where they're hitting, where they're going to need to go fuel on the way in, possibly on the way out, and they would have that all set. But now that things are a bit more fluid and they're providing close air support for troops, things have changed a bit. So what they're doing is the F-18 Hornet over the last couple of days, they've added a third fuel tank on the bottom of that plane. What it's done is it gives them a lot more flexibility to go long haul, so they can basically get out over an area and loiter a bit. If they need to wait on some targets of opportunity, they're getting that opportunity now. They're not having to rely quite so much on tankers, and that seems to be helping them a bit. Now, the downside of that, of course, is they can't carry quite as many weapons because the fuel tanks are quite large. But that's just one way that it seems to be the things are changing by the day here, and they're trying to improve day by day. Back to you.
Kevin, I'm going to make a guess, and I'm sure you'll know, because you seem to be into all this, that they have some F-14s and F-18s on there. I wanted to get a feel for what percentage of the planes are coming back with some of their bombs and missiles still attached.
It's hard for me to give you a percentage, but I would say at the beginning of this campaign, F-14s and F-18s were going out, and they were pretty much all coming back with nothing left. They were dropping pretty much everything, and that, of course, was because that they were targeting fixed targets. Now that they're doing close air support, there's a little bit more discretion. They need to be careful for friendly fire, so they're coming back with a lot more.
All right, Kevin Monahan aboard the USS Constellation. Thank you.
All right, now let's take a look at some images from the front lines. This here, a British soldier checks a young Iraqi boy who fled with his parents on the outskirts of Basra, that's in southern Iraq.
On to another one. British soldiers, 3rd Platoon, 1st Company of the Irish Guards escort a group of Iraqi men before checking their identities. This was on Friday, and the Iraqi men leaving the city of Basra were subsequently released.
This is an undated photo of a British soldier using the cannon of a Challenger 2 tank belonging to the Scotch Dragoon Guards to fix a drawing line after being involved in an action in Basra.
And here's one of a British soldier enjoying a cup of tea with an Iraqi man. This happened near Basra.
All right, and here, a British soldier checks an Iraqi woman and her children on the outskirts of Basra. This happened actually today as residents tried to flee from that southern city.
Now, let's listen to the sounds of war.
That the fighting for coalition soldiers is hardly going to be a walk in the park. Here's ITN's Julian Mannion with more from the north.
U.S. jets are pounding Iraqi troops on the road to Mosul. The Iraqis have been ordered to stand and fight after yesterday's retreat, but they are taking terrible punishment. Earlier, we advanced on foot towards Mosul, which is part of Saddam's heartland. We followed a unit of Kurdish Peshmerga through miles of territory which the Iraqi army has abandoned. With us, half a dozen US Special Forces soldiers, who for a time were hopeful that the enemy had pulled out altogether. So what's your procedure when you get up to a place like this?
Well, usually we sneak up to it at dark in the middle of the night. But seeing how the Peshmerga pretty much secured the whole high ground here, we're just going to walk up there.
There's firing going on.
And they're moving.
We've just heard a shot over there.
Yeah. They got contact front, dude.
The Iraqis were a few hundred yards ahead of us, and they opened fire.
Right there. Right there.
All right.
Soldiers and journalists dived for cover, and the Peshmerga rapidly began to fire back. Huge situation here on the road to Mosul. Up to just a few minutes ago, we were walking calmly down the road with a few members of the US Special Forces. Then our position was fired upon. Since then, both US troops and Kurds have gone into action, as you can see behind me, taking over a former Iraqi army position and opening fire on what they believe are enemy positions further ahead.
Go again, quick.
Kurdish and American troops began to move forward towards the enemy. The Kurds fired rocket-propelled grenades towards their enemy. Iraqi troops fired back from behind a low hill, and their mortar rounds began to land nearby. We took cover.
Roger, grid 7-0.
The Americans called in airstrikes, and the jets screamed in. But tonight, the Iraqis are still holding out on the road to Mosul. Julian Mannion, ITV News, on the Northern Front.
A very real taste of the battlefield as we watch these live nightscope pictures of Baghdad, where the electricity remains out for most, if not all, of that city. We know this war is not over yet. We don't know how much longer it will go on, but we can tell you that already there are arguments about who will run post-war Iraq. State Department correspondent Andrea Koppel with more on that after this. Allies overseas. Here's our congressional correspondent, Jonathan Carl. Hello, John.
Hello, Judy. Earlier this hour, the House rejected an attempt to strip $1 billion in aid to Turkey from the emergency wartime spending bill. But the money survived only after a day of very tough rhetoric on the floors of both the House and the Senate about allies that failed to support the war effort. Some in Congress say it is payback time against American allies that opposed the war against Iraq.
I think that it would be absolutely wrong for American tax dollars to go to countries and to companies in those countries who have tried to turn the world against us.
There needs to be a message sent and a penalty, Mr. Chairman.
Republican Duke Cunningham urged the House to deny the White House the $1 billion it has requested in aid for Turkey because it failed to allow U.S. troops to invade Iraq from Turkish territory.
And I do not mean to demean Turkey by making this point, but merely to make a point. If my own daughters intentionally did something egregious, I'm surely, Mr. Chairman, not going to raise their allowance. I love them. I want their love in the future, and the same goes for Turkey.
The amendment faced strong opposition from the White House, which in a letter from Condoleezza Rice said the aid could play a significant role in bolstering the U.S.-Turkey partnership. In the Senate, Republican John Ensign called France and Germany's behavior in opposing the war despicable and proposed banning German and French citizens and companies from receiving any money to rebuild post-war Iraq.
The United States gives and gives and gives, and it's time for the United States to hold countries accountable that come against us.
That prompted a spirited response from several senators who warned against further straining the U.S. relationship with Germany and France.
I believe we will drive deeper the scar tissue into the psyche of America with this amendment. I believe we will rent apart our alliances with this kind of amendment. I hope, Mr. President.
The White House agreed with that, and a senior administration official called Senator Ensign opposing his bill. Senator Ensign reluctantly withdrew his bill from the floor of the Senate. But, Judy, later today, the House is expected to vote on a bill, again, denying reconstruction money to France, Germany, and other allies on the Security Council that opposed the war. That measure is considered to have a very good chance of passing. Judy?
Jonathan, quickly to another domestic spending issue, and that is spending for the airline industry, which in the United States taking a hit right now during the war with Iraq. The White
We're going to, at moments, you're going to be able to hear some natural sound of firing, but while there are some quiet moments, a little bit of perspective here. It was just hours ago, Saturday actually, that coalition planes bombed a significant building there in Basra, believed to be the home of the man nicknamed Chemical Ali, Ali Hassan al-Majid. He is the cousin of Saddam Hussein. He is the man considered responsible for that hideous gas attack on Kurds back in 1988 in Iraq that killed thousands upon thousands of Kurdish Iraqi civilians. So as of we actually heard from the vice chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff about what the status of Chemical Ali is, because apparently the coalition have been trying to find out whether or not he's alive or dead. It is believed he was home at the time of the strike. We have confirmed that his bodyguard was there, and his body has been found, but no word yet on Chemical Ali. General Peter Pace just said, time will tell. A pretty cryptic answer, but that is something you can be sure that coalition troops are working on. So here once again are the British troops who have entered Basra. From what we understand, they sent in via 2 different entry points some 40 tanks and armored personnel carriers, and they have been going through some of the buildings. Let's listen if we can hear some commentary there on the tape.
Who you want there?
Yeah.
But look, it's so meticulously done as well, isn't it? You know?
Here once again are some of the British troops. What you saw was them going through some of the buildings as they are able to secure some of these buildings to make sure the Fedayeen are not hiding inside. One of the key things that they're going through is looking for documentation relating to weapons of mass destruction. So it's a lot of if you will, mundane work as they go through some of these buildings. But the evidence of WMD is something that has been a priority in this war, and that is one of the things that they're looking for in Basra. That is, once again, Iraq's second largest city and home to many, many Shiites. At the same time, there is more news coming into us from Baghdad. U.S. forces have made a second incursion through Baghdad, destroying and seizing Iraqi armored vehicles. General Peter Pace, he is the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I mentioned him a moment ago. He is saying that U.S. troops have been conducting what he calls armored raids. He says forces have been driving through portions of the Iraqi capital again today, seizing significant numbers of coalition tanks, actually enemy tanks and armored personnel carriers, destroying all the enemy vehicles and personnel with whom they have been coming in contact. Once again, we've been mentioning that coalition troops have basically, American troops have been ringing the city, and that what they've been doing is occasionally going on these probing missions, that collecting intelligence, but also destroying enemy vehicles. And so according to General Peter Pace, there has been another mission of that kind in the city of Baghdad. At the same time, more bombing runs. They began about 10 p.m. Eastern time. It's a fairly hazy morning in Baghdad, and coalition forces, as we mentioned, are back on these probing missions in parts of the city. At the same time, there are an awful lot of fearful Iraqis, some of them left still inside Baghdad and other parts, but others fleeing. Correspondent Heather now standing by live in Amman, Jordan, with some more details on the Iraqi civilians. Heather?
Hi there, Linda. Good morning from here. It's morning now in Baghdad, and now a curfew on Iraqi civilians has been lifted, so neighboring countries are getting ready for what could be an onslaught of refugees. Now, this was a scene on Saturday. Thousands of Iraqi civilians trying to flee the country, driving as far away as they possibly could, just trying to get out of harm's way, but there was still no serious refugee problem. Now, other Iraqis stayed around the city, actually trying to go about their business on Sunday, even as coalition forces crept closer and closer. Now, just an hour ago, as you mentioned, bombing starting again after a fairly quiet evening in Baghdad. 2 bombings are reported to have hit in the central Baghdad area, 9, possibly 10, over to the east of Baghdad. That's the latest from the region. Linda, back to you in New York.
Heather, thanks very much. Once again, before I let you go, talk a little bit more, if you can, about the lifting of this curfew and the influx that they're expecting of Iraqi civilians. How well are they prepared for, you know, some pretty desperate people?
Well, the countries around here, mainly Jordan and some others, have really been trying to prepare for this refugee, what could be a refugee problem. In fact, they thought it might happen weeks ago when the war actually began, but really they've seen virtually no refugees as of yet. So now, as the forces have gotten closer to Baghdad, they believe that the people actually might be fleeing. Well, we know that the people are fleeing the cities, but they think that there could be more of a problem with refugees trying to get out of the country of Baghdad. Now, as for the part about why some of these people might still be there, I think you asked. One of the concerns, though, with that is that Saddam Hussein and his people could attempt to use civilians as human shields. You know, they've done it before, they've done it in recent days, and that could be one reason that they put the curfew on the city to try to keep as many people in as possible. Linda?
Got it. Heather Nauert live with us from Amman, Jordan. A couple of pieces of information we just got in here. Number one, in the past hour, you've seen us showing video of a drone over the city of Baghdad, and originally we mentioned it might have been a Predator drone. Let me drop back because we're getting some information in from our sister network of Sky and some others, basically saying to be careful about how we label this. Sky News, our sister network in Britain, is saying that their analyst believes that the drone that's been seen in the skies over Baghdad in recent minutes may be a short-range hunter drone and may have been launched from the Baghdad International Airport. Unclear at this point, but we just want to make sure that we're a little more careful with what we state. Also, William Lajeunesse reporting in from Kuwait City. When I mentioned the bombing in Basra of Ali Hassan al-Majid's villa, Chemical Ali, the cousin of Saddam Hussein, who's responsible for the massacre of Kurds with poison gas back in 1988 in Iraq. It is believed by some that Chemical Ali, in fact, was killed in that raid. Apparently, according to William Lajeunesse, that local police have told the Brits that Chemical Ali has been killed in that raid. Again, we haven't been able to confirm it with our officials either at the Pentagon or at the CENTCOM forward headquarters, but wanted to let you know what William Lajeunesse was just letting us know via Kuwait City. In the meantime, we're also keeping close eye on this search for Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction. As of yet, Central Command has not confirmed any sort of spectacular finds by coalition troops. The military brass says, though, it is early, so they're not surprised that they haven't found anything extraordinary. What might surprise the brass, though, is there is some evidence that the American public supports this war, whether or not anyone finds the weapons. Correspondent Julie Kurtz is working on this story from our Washington newsroom. Julie?
Hi, Linda. Here's a study in contrast. According to the latest polls in this country, a vast majority of Americans not only support the war, but as you said, they say they'll support the war effort, even if we don't find those weapons of mass destruction. 80%, according to the latest LA Times poll. Now, a different view from the Al Jazeera website tonight. There's a story there on weapons of mass destruction saying U.S. forces will face a global uproar if none of these weapons are found. And so far, none of them have been found, not chemical, biological, or nuclear, according to U.S. military officials. On the ground in Iraq, the evidence of the weapons is so far circumstantial, things like gas masks and chemical suits, no hard evidence of a massive weapons program. Today, Marines are investigating a suspected weapons site from the 1991 Gulf War, but there's no word yet on what they found following a nighttime Saturday night raid along the Tigris River in the town of Salman Pak. And on Friday, in western Iraq, special forces discovered bottles of tabun, a chemical agent used in the 1940s. But Central Command said the site was a training school. So military officials here in Washington are saying that the American people need to be patient about this. Back to you, Linda.
Julie Kurtz in Washington. More details on coalition troop movements and resumed bombing in Baghdad after this.
Tomorrow, the war has pumped up consumer fear.
Good news. Again, this is coming in via the Reuters wire service, and we're talking about the 1st Battalion, 5th Regiment, 1st Marine Division. Apparently, commanders have determined that the threat of a chemical or biological weapons attack has lessened enough to allow the troops to shed this incredibly hot and stifling chemical weapons gear. According to Central Command, at the same time, coalition forces now control Iraq's airspace as well. A C-130 aircraft in the past hours has landed at Baghdad's international airport. The mission unknown, at least to those of us in the press. This is the first known U.S. military aircraft to arrive in the Iraqi capital and land at that airport. So we want to talk about some of these developments. Joining us now is retired U.S. Air Force Colonel Mike Turner. He was General Norman Schwarzkopf's personal briefing officer during Operation Desert Storm. Colonel, thanks for being here.
My pleasure, Linda. Thank you.
First, a comment about this order, at least for one group of our troops, these Marine commanders for the 1st Battalion, 5th Regiment, 1st Marine Division, saying, okay, you guys are clear, you can take off your suits for the first time in 20 days.
It's a major milestone in the battle for Baghdad. There's no question about it. It's another measure of the degree to which the regime in Baghdad has really begun to collapse, to the degree that the army has fallen apart and is now really operating in uncoordinated and isolated pockets, and the movements are uncoordinated. The fact that the field Marine commander is confident enough in the fact that they have so suppressed the enemy defenses and so disrupted the enemy's capacity to defend against coalition attacks that they're removing their chemical gear, that's a very, very good sign. It's a major threshold and a major barrier and a very positive sign that the reduction of Baghdad is probably at this point ahead of schedule.
Question about something we have seen in the skies over Baghdad this hour, which is what appears to be a drone. We're not sure what kind of drone it is, but the fact, just talking about what it can do, because I was looking at some wire reports that have just come in that in the past day or so, at least during the daylight, these Fedayeen militia have been seen sort of roaming the streets. Can a drone like what we've been seeing just in the past few minutes, can this drone actually see like small bands of Fedayeen, or does it not have that kind of resolution?
I'm not as familiar with the drone technology. I can tell you that if I simply extrapolate based on the cockpit technology we had in the F-16 and the F-111 12 years ago, absolutely. It can see formations. What it will not be able to discern, obviously, are individual Fedayeen moving within a civilian population. But insofar as these units, any units, if it's Republican Guard or Special Republican Guard or the Fedayeen, any quasi-military movement in a formation, a vehicle, convoy, anything like that, the drone will certainly be able to discern either with straight visuals, normal black and white imagery, possibly even color imagery, but also with thermal imagery, infrared imagery. It will be able to pick out those movements and discern those movements with very great precision and very great accuracy. It flies, I noticed on your graphic a while ago, about 138 miles an hour, 130 miles an hour. Or knots, if you will, and obviously at that altitude and at that airspeed, it can loiter or stay on station overhead for a very long period of time, take pictures from all different angles, real-time video, and it's a wonderful source of information for the battlefield. It's a wonderful development and obviously a major player in the urban close air support environment.
Here's a wide-open question, so answer what you feel comfortable with.
I like those.
In the next, it's daylight now in Baghdad, and each day we've seen some remarkable advances. So if you had to predict what we're going to see during the next hours of daylight in Baghdad, what do you think it'll be?
This is interesting, and it's a great question. I think that, and just from looking at the news reports, that we have we've taken a battlefield twist, a shift in the battlefield, which is a requirement to place units to essentially reduce the smaller towns to the south. We've turned that to our advantage, and we are using those as templates and models, successful models actually, to determine how we're going to proceed in Baghdad. So as we see the British forces who have extensive experience in urban combat reduce Basra in a way which maximizes the protection of the civilian population, minimizes the risk to coalition forces, and isolates specific targets to further destabilize the regime at lower and lower levels day by day. It's a methodical, patient, determined approach. It appears to me that that's what we're doing in Baghdad, and the good news is we're following that approach, but the activities on the ground, the decay and the breakdown is occurring at such a cascading and accelerating effect that we're actually able, even in that patient process, to accelerate that process even further. So they will move cautiously with deliberate speed,
focusing on precise targets and known locations, but also but being very careful about the civilian population.
Some people might be looking at our progress of the past, say, 48, 72 hours and seeing how well we're moving into Baghdad, and we're able to move almost virtually unchallenged into the city center and conduct these probing missions. And they might be tempted to say, okay, great, when's the surrender? Is that, is that overly optimistic that, in a day or so we see, important generals come out with their hands up?
I'm not sure you're going to see as fine and clear-cut a line of demarcation as you just described. Okay, at this point we now surrender. I'm not sure that they even have sufficient command and control anymore for anyone to be an authority to surrender. You may just see the attenuation and the withering on the vine, if you will, of this command structure in Baghdad to the point where it's simply no longer relevant, that the Allies simply find themselves in overwhelming command of the entire city, and we just pass a threshold where everyone just simply acknowledges the war is essentially over and we're dealing with banditry now. We're not dealing with any sort of a cohesive force. It certainly appears that that's the direction we're headed. I don't see a lot of command and control that has the capacity to surrender at this point.
Colonel Mike Turner, we thank you very much for the analysis on the fly. We appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you, Linda.
All right, as we get ready for the top of the hour, I'm Linda Vester signing off here in New York, but keep it here on Fox. We have continuing live coverage throughout the night as we continue to look at Baghdad. That on the right-hand side of your screen, a live picture, a new round of bombing raids, also more incursions by U.S. troops. Keep it here on Fox for the very latest developments. Good night.
Watching Fox News continuing coverage of Operation Iraqi Freedom. I'm Brian Wilson in Washington. I'll be joined in just a moment by Allison Camerata in New York. But first, here's the very latest. Another incursion into Baghdad by U.S. troops as they further tighten the noose around Baghdad, and they have cut off most of the approaches to the capital. Witnesses said earlier in the day they heard planes and explosions hit the city's southern outskirts. Meanwhile, coalition forces continue to secure the area around Baghdad International Airport, some 10 miles away from the center of town. A huge U.S. C-130 transport plane landed at the airport today, making it the first known landing of a U.S. supply plane at the airport since it fell into the hands of coalition forces. And in the south, British troops rolled into the southern city of Basra in an attempt to finally gain complete control of Iraq's second largest city. A spokesman for British forces says the action was meant in part to reassure the residents of Basra that coalition forces are there to liberate them. And judging by the reaction of many of the residents, that message seemed to be getting through. Time now to say hello to Allison Camerata, who joins me from New York. Hello, Allison.
Hi, Brian. And thanks. I want to go right away to the Pentagon, where Kelly Wright is standing by live with the latest. Hi, Kelly.
Hi, Allison and Brian. Day by day, mile by mile, the coalition ground forces continue to make their thrust deeper into the heart of Baghdad. And in fact, there are other reports that they're also getting into other areas and taking control of those areas. Karbala, for example, they took control there. The Pentagon officials telling us that they are reasonably certain that most of that city, that holy Shiite Muslim city, is now under coalition control. We take you live now to pictures of Baghdad, where the coalition forces are tightening their grip around the city. 2 bombs hit the center of Baghdad and several more struck the outskirts of the Iraqi capital in dawn raids on Monday. The raids followed a relative lull of almost 12 hours in the U.S.-led aerial assault on Baghdad. Artillery fire had continued on and off through the night. There are reports that Saddam Hussein, through a statement read on Iraqi TV, urged Iraqi troops separated from their combat squads to join other fighters to fend off the Americans. Defense officials here tell me there are indications of disarray among the Iraqi forces. Meantime, U.S. forces have tightened their grip on most roads leading to the area. At Baghdad International, another visible sign of coalition control, a C-130 landed today, the first coalition aircraft to land in Baghdad. You're looking at a similar version of that C-130. The C-130 Hercules aircraft is often used for dropping troops or delivering equipment and supplies and can land in rough terrain and on rough landing strips. To the south, in the holy Shiite city of Karbala, as I mentioned, defense officials say most of the city is under coalition control after an intense day of fighting street to street with Iraqi paramilitary forces threatening U.S. supply lines north to Baghdad. As coalition forces took more control of Karbala, there were reports that Iraqi citizens greeted them with cheers and shouting, "Good, good," and also welcoming them to their area. That's the latest here from the Pentagon. The coalition continues to move, and the report out of CENTCOM is that the tough days of fighting still lie ahead. This war is not over.
Okay, Kelly Wright, thank you. Let's go back down to Washington and Brian Wilson.
That's right, and here we go, ladies and gentlemen. We're off and running. We have Greg Kelly on the phone, apparently in the midst of some action. Greg is with the Army's 3rd ID. Greg, what's the latest?
Brian, do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead, Greg.
All right, great. Hey, listen, the second time in 48 hours, a combat are deep inside Baghdad. We're going further inside the city than last time. Really to the heart of the city. It's fair to column of tanks. The resistance we've seen so far has been sporadic. 2 days ago, but it's there. About 2 minutes ago, an RPG, rocket-propelled grenade fired the column. From time to time, we'll see small arms fire. The tanks, the M1 tanks in the column continue to fire in hard positions and the like along the side of the road. We haven't seen these dismount soldiers running around. For now, it's a somewhat quieter than it was 2 days ago. But we're moving into the heart of the city. I can tell you more when we get there. Too many deaths.
All right, well, apparently we have lost Greg Kelly. His cell phone, his satellite phone actually, hanging by a thread. Listen, I know that the communication level there was not great. Let me recap what I at least caught of that conversation. He is once again on a maneuver through the city, this time into the heart of Baghdad. If you're with us a couple of nights ago, we had Greg Kelly on the line as the 3rd ID Tank Division kind of went through a corner of Baghdad and went into the Baghdad airport, former Saddam Hussein airport. That was the first official foray into Baghdad proper. It sounds like Greg Kelly is with his tank unit again. This time they are headed into the heart of the city. He said there was sporadic fighting, but there was fighting there. And so once again, it does appear that we are beginning to move heavy equipment into Baghdad, if Greg Kelly's report is correct. And if I heard him correct, I believe he said they're headed into the heart of the city this time. This would be a good time to stick with us tonight, folks, because as we get our communications problems worked out, we have a tremendous ability to bring you information right from the very scene where it's happening. But right now, until we get that communication reestablished, go back up to New York and Allison.
Thanks, Brian. Maybe this is a good opportunity right now to take a look back at all of the things that Greg Kelly has seen and brought us in the past 48 hours. Let's take a look at those images.
That sign says Baghdad.
That's just incredible stuff that Greg Kelly has been seeing in the past few days. And as you heard just a moment ago, he checked in once again on the roll through Baghdad with the Army's 3rd Infantry Division, headed this time, he says, to the heart of the city. He says there has been sporadic fire, but there has been some resistance. Look, it's time now to check in while we can with Wayne Simmons, and while we wait to see if we hear from Greg Kelly again. Wayne Simmons is a former CIA operative and retired U.S. Navy. Boy, you were talking about the pictures that you saw there. I mean, it just is incredible. As a person who's been in his share of trouble from time to time, what are your thoughts when you see those kinds of images?
Well, the first thing which is clear is that our men and women are so incredibly prepared. They have obviously the very best technology. They just, as you saw what they did to those vehicles in short order. And clearly, as I think everyone recognizes, the success or failure of any military operation begins with clandestine intelligence ops, and how successful that military mission is going to be depends on how accurate that information is.
In the last hour or so, we have heard the drones are apparently up. We're not sure what kind of drone it is, but some kind of intelligence drone, it would appear, is up and flying over Baghdad, unmolested, I might add. And we've also heard reports that some of the soldiers have been told you can stand down on your chemical suit. We don't think there's a threat there. Does that concern you?
It does, Brian. I guess my top concern right now would be that, as you and I have talked about off air, and this is something that the Iraqis are notorious for, are famous for, terrorists are famous for, sectional, deliberate traps. When I hear that our guys are standing down, taking off their suits, it bothers me. I would not take those off until we know for a fact that we occupy the city, Saddam Hussein is dead, and we control everything.
These probing maneuvers that the Army's 3rd ID are conducting into the heart of Baghdad, what is the purpose of that? I mean, is it to again demonstrate to Saddam Hussein resistance, to quote an old Star Trek movie, is futile?
Well, that's part of it, but remember, these probing missions into these are being preceded by our special ops team. So we're already there. The deep cover guys have already been there. Our special ops teams are already there, and now we have the military following it up, and we're sending a clear signal. It is futile. We are here, and we're taking you down now. Give up.
And special ops is, of course, where your expertise lies. What kind of things are going on inside the city of Baghdad right now, do you imagine? I know you don't have any first-hand knowledge.
Well, everyone, of course, first and foremost, is trying to stay alive. And when things appear that we're taking control of a situation is when you're most vulnerable, because you'll have a tendency to let your own guard down. You cannot do that. And I can tell you from personal experience, the deep cover intelligence operatives are the ones, as I've mentioned before, that are the most vulnerable, because we don't know who's going to betray them. We don't know what deals were cut. We don't know who's been contacted or recontacted. So it's a very, very tenuous time for everybody.
I would imagine one of the top priorities of the special ops guys trying to find leadership, identify them, point them out. If they happen to find out where they are, call in an airstrike.
Well, look, the worst thing for anyone right now is to look like, resemble, number one, Saddam Hussein or any other member of that leadership, because if you even remotely resemble them, you're probably going if you make yourself available. The special ops guys are very, very highly skilled, the best, the brightest, so incredibly patient at virtually everything from electronics to staying hidden.
Talk about that, though, because you have to have not only a great deal of training in how to lay low and to observe from a distance, to blend in with your background, all that stuff that you know, they're in the spy movies, but you also have to be pretty bright these days, because the technology is incredibly complicated and incredibly impressive.
Well, I can tell you from the ops that we ran, and I can tell you we're very, very good at staying hidden. Personally, I know we're good at staying hidden because I stayed hidden even from our own government, with the exception of a very, very select few inside the agency that even knew we existed. So these ops that are out there, these special ops teams that are out there, know how to stay hidden, and they're very, very, very good at it. Normally superior or greater IQ, have the ability to learn virtually anything in hours as opposed to days or months or years. So you have to be light on your feet. You have to be able to use chameleon devices or stealth devices to stay hidden and stay alive.
And what kind of, can you go into any detail about when you say chameleon or stealth devices?
You've got to become just like the enemy that you're seeking.
Yes.
If you're going against narcotics traffickers, you become a narcotics trafficker. If you're going against the Iraqis, the terrorists, it's very difficult in this era to do that because the circles are so closely tight-knit. With the narcotics traffickers, it was totally different. So this is a very, very different ball game. It's much more difficult to penetrate these circles. But so many different devices to use to portray yourself as one of the bad guys.
And I would imagine that it's not a very comforting time to be a member of the Iraqi leadership, knowing that there are what? And I don't want to, you know, compromise anybody's security. Are we talking about dozens? We're talking about hundreds? We're talking about more than that?
Well, the number doesn't really matter, Brian. I can only tell you this. If I'm part of the Iraqi leadership and I wake up one morning and a guy like me or these special ops guys is sitting on my doorstep, I'm going to have a bad day.
Yeah, because that means trouble is coming.
Oh, you're going to have a bad day. And we are relentless. We will not be denied, not ever. We will absolutely succeed. These guys are the very, very, very best that we have.
What's the most impressive thing you've seen thus far in all the coverage? What has caught your eye?
The swiftness of the operation. This will go down, as I'm sure you would agree, and many will agree, as one of the single greatest military operations ever. That will prove true. And as I said earlier, the success and failure of a military mission hinges most of the time on the dependability of the intelligence that is secured prior to the assault.
And with about a minute left, I want to ask you about the one troubling thing that has been happening in this. Although it has been a swift campaign, no doubt, there have been a tremendous number of friendly fire incidents. We had apparently another one today. This is a real problem when you're in a battlefield situation where it's sometimes hard to determine who is friend and who is foe.
Absolutely, and this is not anything new, as we all know. It happens on our soil. It happens every day when police raid drug dealers. These are unfortunate parts of any close combat, and in this instance, with this war, you know, it happened in '91. We called in strikes on our own tanks, and it's unfortunate. And today's technology, it happens a lot less.
Wayne Simmons, a guy who has had a very interesting life in the U.S. Navy, a former CIA operative, a man who actually infiltrated narco-terrorism circles at one point. He knows, ladies and gentlemen, of what he speaks. Thanks a lot.
My pleasure, Brian.
Let's go back to New York and Allison Camerata.
Thanks, Brian. I just want to remind our viewers that we have an embedded reporter inside Baghdad tonight where all of the action is, and we'll be talking to him coming up. So stay tuned for continuing coverage of Operation Iraqi Freedom. We've got much more ahead, including some incredible exclusive video that you'll only see on Fox. Stick around.
Hi, I'm aviation electronic technician Michael Rivers, and I'm aboard the USS Kittiak, and I'd like to say hello to my family in Odessa, Missouri. And I'd like to say that I love Fox News.
The Iraqis get a vote in this. This is the start of the battle for Baghdad, but that battle is going to be fluid, it's going to be complex, it's going to be different, and it's difficult to understand. It's not just going to be a rush forward, no opposition, and we're just going to take the whole city. It is going to be a lot of experimentation, it's going to be a lot of intelligence flowing in, it's going to be changes of course. This is going to be very difficult to follow, very complex. So it may be the real thing, but doesn't mean that this particular probe is going to be the main axis of attack that we're going to see.
What is your greatest concern?
My greatest concern is what we've seen in Basra, what we saw in Nasiriyah, what we saw in Karbala. Very small numbers of very dedicated forces able to hold us up for a very long time. Remember, in Basra, we have been fighting a battle now for 2 weeks against small forces. We have two criteria. We don't want to take a lot of casualties ourselves unnecessarily. We don't want to inflict a humanitarian disaster on the city. That puts some constraints on how we can operate. That we spend time for that. They spent a lot of time in Basra over that. That's the model we're going to see here. Because remember, Tommy Franks commanded the Battle of Basra. The British were reporting to him. That's where he learned the tactics that he's going to use. And that's the only reason I'm cautioning, be very careful about saying this is the final battle, because in Basra, we're still unfolding the end.
I want to ask you what your greatest concern is as far as a surprise. Does Saddam Hussein still have a couple of tricks up his sleeve?
Well, my suspicion is that he may still use chemical weapons in his last moments. My concern is that he does have suicide bombers who will come out at our troops, particularly our infantry, and take them out. I'm very concerned about those oil ditches that we heard about. We just heard some information about some very large fires burning. He may be setting them off. That could create smoke that the A-10s can't see through. He can't win. The Iraqis cannot win this war. They can delay it. They can make it very uncomfortable for us, as they did in Karbala. They can hold us off for a while and cause some casualties.
All right, David Friedman, Dr. David Friedman. Dr. George Friedman, excuse me, my mistake. Thank you for joining us from Austin, Texas. We appreciate it. Let's go back to New York and Allison Camerata.
Thanks, Brian. You're watching continuing coverage of Operation Iraqi Freedom. The battle for Baghdad is now underway. We will bring you more live reports from our embedded reporter as soon as we can. Meanwhile, I am joined now here in New York by Stephen Brill. He is the author of After How America Confronted the September 12th Era. Did I get that right? Yes. Hi, Mr. Brill. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, how are you?
I'm fine. This book of yours is causing quite a media firestorm. Why is it so controversial?
I think because its basic conclusion is that on the morning of September 12th, beginning the morning of September 12th, I narrate a story of a year in the lives of about a dozen people who were on the front lines at home of the battle we're talking about. And my conclusion is that we got tougher, and our system worked, and the country is a lot stronger because the country was not the soft place that some people thought it was.
And some people don't like that conclusion, that we've gotten tougher and stronger?
They're surprised, they're skeptical, they don't think that the people that I described, the customs inspectors on the ports in New Jersey, a Border Patrol agent in Detroit, people working at the airports, they're sort of cynical about them. They don't think this country works as well as it does, and they're also cynical, frankly, about my treatment of Tom Ridge, for example.
Who you're a fan of.
I think he's done a really good job, and I think that he and the people working for him have been, highly dedicated, have gone through lots of agony, lots of tough work, lots of bad press, and this isn't a Pollyanna book. This doesn't say that, that we're completely safe. It doesn't say that everything's wonderful, but it does give the American people and the people on the front lines the credit they deserve. And basically it says that today, the reason that we're not the victim of more terrorist attacks when we go to war overseas is not simply that we're lucky, and not simply that the terrorists are in a good mood, but that we've actually taken a lot of steps behind the scenes. And this book narrates those steps that we've taken behind the scenes. We've taken a lot of steps that have made us safer.
As you're speaking, we're watching these live pictures from Baghdad.
Right.
Did this war in Iraq that we are now seeing in some ways begin on September 12th?
Absolutely. I think in two ways. First of all, in terms of the country's attitude, which was that we're not going to just be victims anymore. We're not going to sit there and take it. And I think that part of what we're doing overseas is the result of that. And second, I think that we really showed a spirit at home that's like what we're showing abroad, except here we can see it on television. It's war. You don't see the war that I narrate in this book, the war on the ports, the war on the borders, the war in the airports. It's a quiet war. It's a bunch of dedicated public servants working behind the scenes, making agonizing decisions. It's FBI agents going out and doing a lot of controversial things that ended up working. Doesn't mean they didn't make mistakes, but this system that is America, where people contend with each other and fight with each other over policy, it turned out to be a lot better than we thought.
Mr. Brill, stick around for 1 second. We want to go down to Brian Wilson, who has a reporter from Baghdad on with him. Brian?
Yes, Chris Jumpelt is a German TV reporter who has been nice enough to join us from time to time. Chris, I want to give you an update on what I know, and then I want to ask you what you know. According to the Associated Press, Troops seized key buildings in the center of the Iraqi capital on Monday, including a major presidential palace and the information ministry. Reporters saw the tanks roll into the heart of Baghdad on the western side of the Tigris River, which divides the city. Also occupied was the Al Rashid Hotel. How does that gel with what you can see and what you know?
Yes, good morning, Brian. Well, it jives in quite a way. I think we can safely say now that the American troops have reached the heart of Baghdad. Across the river from me, I'm on the eastern bank. I can see tanks sitting on the western bank on what is the premises of a palatial palace complex there. There is fighting going on. We've seen infantrymen running around. We've seen small arms fire being shot. There is one presumably Iraqi tank ablaze right on the riverbank as we speak.
Right on the river banks. So how would you characterize the fighting? Is it heavy? Is it moderate conflict? How would you describe it?
It's steady and intense.
We are looking, while we talk to you, we are looking at pictures from Lebanese TV as we speak. We see some fire coming across what looks to be a trench or a ditch of some kind. And maybe we could we lower that banner, please, so we can see what's going on. Thank you very much. Apparently there are some tanks also in this scene. Chris, what is the mood there? Because it would seem that this
videotape, that we struck a target of opportunity this afternoon and that they had acted on a tip from folks on the ground that leadership may have been inside this home inside Baghdad, a home as it's been described to us by multiple sources. It's believed in the early going that inside that home were Saddam Hussein and his two sons, or that was the thinking in the very early going. They conducted this bombing and dropped what multiple sources tell us was a large amount of ordnance that this particular home about which I'm speaking and that I believe is from this particular bombing was leveled and blown to smithereens. And though a source tells us that they had reason to believe Saddam Hussein and his sons were seen going into this home, neither Saddam nor Hussein nor his sons were seen coming out. The long and short of it is, sources tell Fox News there is a strong belief that in fact Saddam Hussein and his two sons may have been killed in this bombing campaign. We're working to get our senior correspondent Rita Cosby, who has this double source, and a couple of others on as well. Our Pentagon correspondent Brett Baer is working his sources at the Pentagon. Brett, what can you say?
Shep, we can confirm that the U.S. military Central Command targeted what they're calling a leadership target of opportunity in a residential neighborhood in and around Baghdad. They used a lot of ordnance, we're told. Defense officials telling us that it was a significant amount of ordnance on this one particular building. It's described as a target of opportunity. Nothing specific as far as who was inside. However, officials tell us that it was leadership targets that were taken out here. Now, what exactly was the result of this? The battle damage assessment is still going on. However, it was a significant crater created in this one particular spot, this one building. We have other sources telling Fox News that there was indeed a belief that Saddam Hussein and his sons may have been inside this building. Military officials are only confirming that it was a target of opportunity, and leadership targets, high-level Iraqi regime leadership targets were targeted with this strike. Chip?
Yeah, that's the information that we're getting as well, Brett. They were acting on eavesdropping and a tip, according to multiple sources, to multiple correspondents within Fox News Channel, acting on significant and human information coming from multiple sources. And the bottom line of what we believe to have happened as of this moment is that Saddam Hussein and his son were, according to a number of sources, to have been inside this home. That coalition forces acted very quickly and with a great deal of ordnance. You may remember the first night of all of this, when the first target happened, the first night when President Bush changed much of the early going of the plan because George Tenet, for lack of a better phrase, walked into his office and said, "President, I think we have them." And the president threw out the early game plan, at least for the opening moments of this war, and decided to drop some 40 different missiles and heavy bombs on this bunker. It was believed, at least, that Saddam Hussein may have been injured in the early going. There were some reports that he may have had some injuries to his legs. You know that there were reports that Saddam Hussein may have come out of this particular building on a stretcher and may have been taken away in an ambulance. Well, then today, after this seizure of the palace in downtown Baghdad, after the moving on his parade grounds, which we witnessed live last night on Fox News Channel, shortly thereafter, approximately, if I could remember the exact time, I would, that videotape came in, but I think it was between 12:30 and 1:30 Eastern Time. They had gotten, and this is the videotape from that, as seen on Abu Dhabi television and through the Fox News Channel at the time. This was the biggest bombing of the day. Our producers who watch tape and watch incoming feeds all day said that this was the biggest of it all. It was after sundown in Baghdad. They're 8 hours ahead of Eastern Time. So between 9:30, around that time, when this strike of significance happened, this strike of opportunity was carried out. And again, the sources were telling leadership that, in fact, it was believed that Saddam Hussein and his sons may have been in there. They acted on eavesdropping and on some other on-the-ground sort of information that they were getting. So they bombed this target and did so with a great deal of ordnance. And though we have not been able to get any specific reports from the ground, we have no correspondent who has seen this building after, in fact, it was bombed. It was described to me by a source and to Rita Cosby by a source as a home. It was described to a couple of other of our correspondents by sources to have been a building, be that as it may. Multiple sources all telling us that their intelligence is that it was reduced to rubble. Now, do they see this from aerial drones? Did they see this from spy satellites? Exactly how they saw that this was reduced to rubble, we really don't know. And we don't know if maybe it was a person who saw it up close on the ground, but I can tell you that it wasn't one of our correspondents or anyone with whom we have touch. At any rate, multiple confirmations that this building was reduced to rubble, and multiple confirmations that Saddam Hussein and his sons did not come out of that building. So if it all adds up properly, as we believe at least in the early reporting that it does, Saddam Hussein, this is the most recent tape of him, I believe this was earlier today, no, this is the tape from the other day, you may remember. Saddam Hussein and his sons seen going into that building and not seen coming out. Does that mean that they've killed or believe that they have killed Saddam Hussein? I can tell you that sources who are speaking with a group of us